I'd like to welcome everyone to the Symposium, which has been coordinated by Shaun Murray, who's he's an international architectural professional with more than 10 years' experience in architecture and environmental design, focusing on ecological principles and design communication. So Shaun has his own practice called Eniatype, and he's just edited a journal called Design Ecologies, which we'll be launching later on this evening. And I'd like to thank him for organising such an eclectic mix of interesting design professionals and kind of people from peripheral related fields around architecture to discuss ideas of how we design and how we operate within our own individual design practices. So I'll pass him over to introduce the day. Thanks, Shaun.
Thank you very much. First off, I'd like to kind of introduce the journal. I'm the principal editor of this kind of new architectural peer-reviewed design journal. With it being peer-reviewed, every article submission will be anonymously kind of critiqued by two people on the editorial advisory board. It's published through Intellect. Intellect are kind of a well-known journal publisher. This is the first time they've kind of moved into the architectural, spatial kind of realm. So they kind of are looking forward to having something which obviously people would like to kind of read and discuss and critique. So in kind of more general terms, Design Ecologies is hopefully looking to connect about different practices, methodologies of communication. I think for the first three issues, I've kind of tried to work out or plan a kind of a working kind of methodology to be able to integrate various kind of articles into the journal. If I just go through why it's called Design Ecologies, it's probably a good start, and then move on to the main kind of themes for the first issue and the second issue, which is what we're discussing today. The first issue is called Burgeoning Practices, which is basically an eclectic mix of some very young, very interesting, inspiring practices who are doing research as well as actually practicing kind of architecture and spatial design. And there's also a section on case studies, which is a series of projects and short profiles on lots of kind of other kind of fresh practices. So it's quite a colourful, image-based journal, but obviously the articles will be able to be accessed online for researchers to be able to use and critique. So Design Ecologies, I think I see design, which obviously etymologically, whatever it's called, is the idea of drawing forth ideas, but designing is about that connection of the ideas through your practice. So the idea of kind of this journal as being a collection or an ecology of ideas, each journal hopefully is seen as a mix of kind of disparate kind of agendas, but kind of somehow connected through the way different designers communicate their design. Because I think it's really interesting, well, for myself and hopefully for the potential subscribers, about how people actually communicate design and work with that within their practices. Ecologies is generally all about how things interact, how things work with each other, play off each other. We all, I would say, edit our own ecologies. We make decisions on what's important, what's not important in our own ecological framework. And the way that we edit is quite subjective to every designer. You choose from a set of things to decide on what's important, what's not important. And I think that's also quite important, a kind of a levels of communication or a hierarchy of decision making as a designer in your kind of design process about what it is that you're working with. If you're designing a building or you're designing a system, which I think is actually what a lot of architects do. So that's the first part. Ecologies are kind of all around us, within us. We can talk about social ecologies. If we want to talk about kind of more, I would say, not reductionist models, but models which begin to be named using the word ecology, which is kind of interesting. Social ecologies, technological ecologies, so I think the idea is that you decide on what it is, your own kind of way of communicating design is kind of hopefully what's interesting. So also Design Ecologies Journal is organised in kind of 5 major parts. These parts within it, the first part is ideation, which is a general overview of what is actually happening within the other kind of sections in the journal. We have Timothy Morton, who will be writing the ideation for the next collection of ideas, and then we move into kind of the 4 kind of main sections, which is ecological, notational, instructional, and aesthetical. So if we move on to the first slide, this is the first issue, which will be available today through the AA Bookshop, and it's entitled Burgeoning Practices. And essentially, it's people's struggle with how to communicate design. The idea of aesthetic experiences, who instructs whom in certain relationships of actually designing and communicating things. It's less about the kind of a formalistic model of reducing design to pure image making and trying to unpack the complexity of people's practices. Today we're talking about the Unprimed Canvas. The initial kind of driver for this was I watched a series of interviews with Francis Bacon on YouTube and really kind of just listened to what he was talking about and the way that he actually designed. The Unprimed Canvas came up in conversation quite a lot with him, where he seemed to use it as a vehicle. One, he said it was a financial thing, but also the idea of that every mark you make is on this indelible surface, which can't be erased with any kind of chemicals. So this idea of every mark you make has some kind of trace or permanence or leaves a residue behind, I think is actually really important for architectural spatial designers, in the sense that how we use kind of computer modeling and how people use lots of bits of kit, I would call it, technological kit, that this kind of thing that's left behind is somehow invisible. When you do a computer model, you can erase all the kind of the wireframe. When somebody shows you an interactive piece, you don't get to see the code or the script behind, because it's almost deemed sacrilege to show the ingredients where you've actually sourced it from. But I think a lot of designers now, the idea of unpacking what's behind the scenes, and hopefully some of the speakers today, I think, have exceptional practices which really just work behind the scenes and develop a model of practice which is actually not about developing a primed canvas. It seems to be all about mark making and leaving traces and residues and things behind within their own way of working, which I think is kind of quite unique for a few kind of practices, where they don't mind talking about the dirty stuff, the messy stuff, the stuff which isn't quite finished, the stuff which isn't quite polished and honed for people's kind of eyes. So if I just quickly move on to the next slide. I'm just going to hopefully introduce the 4 kind of panels that we'll be talking about today. But I'm more going to talk about it from my own subjective perspective about what inspires me on each of these. So I'm just going to use one image and the title. So there'll be 4 panels. The first one is ecological. This is something which I've always been kind of inspired by. This is Friedrich Kiesler's work. Kiesler was a theatre designer, stage set designer, early on in his life, and he also had one of his monolithic projects, which is called the Endless House, which seemed to continue on for 40 years. A project which never found completion, because the actual completion of it was within the thinking about it and him working with it. It was a project, and I'm actually quite fascinated by this piece, which has the strange objects which are there in the middle are known as coriolistic instruments, he called them, tables and chairs, and they would have 15 positions of arrangement in the space. And the way the frames are suspended away from the gallery walls, it's trying to introduce you to a different relationship to painting, a different relationship to observing, to viewing, and that kind of situation of breaking down and fragmenting a kind of quite a formalistic tradition before of how one would view a painting in a gallery, I think it's quite inspiring. By making slight movements, slight adjustments, you actually are opening up a whole series of other things. This is an image that I produced. This is like glass that's been melted together, and I think what I'm really interested in is modelling relationships, practices which deal with that tension of somehow, somewhere, there's things happening, but not quite sure how explicit you can be about it. These relationships, as I was saying, that we choose how to edit them and how to kind of deliver them in their own practices, I think is really interesting about what it is that you do edit. What do you kind of put as importance? I'm very interested in how to empower participation within an idea of practice, and how to bring people, although I've struggled a lot with that when I was writing my PhD, where I just set up a series of kind of sessions to think about people as part of designing. And this is another image. So these to me are kind of, I have a lot of images around when I work as a practitioner, and the images are kind of just triggers for me. I leave them kind of in one space or dotted around the house. As ways to kind of record a memory of something which kind of excited me about something. Whether it gets used or not is kind of besides the point. It's stuff which is kind of around you, but yet somehow it is, unpacking your practice in kind of your studio space. The second panel will be about notational design vision. I find notational design vision is really on the move at the moment, in the sense that the way people use kind of notation to coordinate, direct, to instruct, to inform people about how to operate and move through spaces. Notation within obviously an architectural professional in a reductionist model is through building information modeling, using CAD, creating signs and symbols to be able to tell somebody what is a wall, what is a chair, what is a table, what is a step. But obviously it's a lot more complex than that when we think about a notational system that's spatial, that's actually, we're already a part of it, it's already out there. This is notational model which I love. This is obviously cave paintings which are in southern France in a cave, but to me it's the notations that are embedded within the context. They're a part of the context. The person who's left the cave, there's some fundamental connection with where the notations are made and how they're kind of embedded inside its kind of environment. And I think that is kind of quite crucial. I think this one's an interesting image in the sense this is a rock in Rothermere, I think, in Scotland, and it's got cups and marks in the stone. And it was obviously people don't know how old it is, but it relates to as if the celestial system, stars, are kind of drilled holes into this rock face. So this rock hasn't moved, and it seems to be a part of the connection with another system. It's not something that's kind of been inverted, as if you would take a painting or draw somebody and paint them and then take it somewhere else. It's somehow, when you step into this and look at these holes, you're actually looking at the mirroring of where it's come from, which I think is just kind of quite a simple idea, but I think this connection between something and something else, I think is really kind of fundamental about designing notational systems which somehow grounded within actual spaces. Instructional design vision. I think this is kind of fascinating of how many people like to be told what to do. Who instructs whom, who informs whom, how we people operate in space through many kind of systems of communication. Within design practice, especially architectural models, we work in a place where there is kind of a very reductionist model where we don't design buildings, we design systems, we communicate with other people about things. But when you see architects rolling down the street in big pimped up vans, and then they say, "Oh, I did that with a new client," what did they really do? They drew a picture, they had a lot of meetings, they didn't put the bricks. The fundamental of it is kind of somehow separate. This I find fascinating. This is Joachim Hendrick's project from 1995. And this was published with the Allgemein, which is the German, I think it's their kind of like international newspaper. And this, he was fascinated by retinal eye scan, actually just watching eye movements, how somebody reads something. And they were giving out the reading of the newspaper. So I think this lady here had already read the paper, and then they were giving it as another copy. And it's almost that idea of how you're instructed to scan over a sheet of paper, and this kind of sensibility and this kind of organization of how we're given certain bits of information. So the rereading of the newspaper, and you're reading the reading of it. I find that kind of just fascinating in the sense of this one separation, but yet probably 1 million people might read in the same way that they scan with their eyes across the stretch of a newspaper which is out daily. Aesthetical design visions, obviously this is a struggle one because I think it's quite subjective actually. I mean, these are all my models, which are known as a priori models. These are tentative steps of me as a practitioner thinking about design before delivering something. A lot of these models and sketches and diagrams are somehow always behind the scenes. I mean, when I did my kind of architectural thesis, it was always kind of utopic, kind of segregated, kind of insular. I did a series of kind of transdisciplinary sessions, which is basically with a bunch of researchers talking about GPS and ultrasound, also looking at rapid prototyping and a building energy management system, and thinking about people making connections, working with programmers where I was teaching at University of Plymouth. So this idea of researching through in the system, before an outcome, which I think is kind of, really, really interesting. So that's the kind of the general plan for today, is kind of 4 distinct sessions. So we're going to kick off with the first person, which is Timothy Morton. Timothy Morton comes from UC Davies. He's sent us a video. He will be listening on Skype to be able to do questions later. Timothy Morton is kind of fascinating in the sense that he's pushing an ecological model. He's kind of quite philosophical, really makes lots of connections between things, and he's written a series of books, one called The Ecological Fort and Ecology Without Nature, where normally people think of ecology as natural. So let's kick off with him, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I think I've got sound plugged in. Oh, sorry.
Systems.
If I just go to the beginning, right.
In complex systems of affiliation. Systems. It turns out not to be a totally relational mesh, but a coexistence of vast, discrete, irreducibly strange and opaque objects, which I now call hyperobjects. Hyperobjects, like global warming, 7% of whose effects will still be around 100,000. The more we figure out how enmeshed we are in complex systems of affiliation, the more we become aware of some very strange entities that seem to emerge from these systems. Our reality turns out not to be a totally relational mesh, but a coexistence of vast, scary, discrete, irreducibly strange and opaque objects, which I now call hyperobjects. Hyperobjects, like global warming, 7% of whose effects will still be around 100,000 years from now, as rocks absorb the last of the greenhouse gases. Hyperobjects like the gigantic BP oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico last year. Hyperobjects like evolution, stretching our ideas of finite time to breaking point. Hyperobjects like plutonium. The more we figure out how enmeshed we are in complex systems of affiliation, the more we become aware of some very strange entities that seem to emerge from these systems. Our reality turns out not to be a totally relational mesh, but a coexistence of vast, scary, discrete, irreducibly strange and opaque objects, which I now call hyperobjects. Hyperobjects, like global warming, 7% of whose effects will still be around 100,000 years from now, as rocks absorb the last of the greenhouse gases. Hyperobjects like the gigantic BP oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico last year. Hyperobjects like evolution, stretching our ideas of finite time to breaking point. Hyperobjects like plutonium-239, scanning us with their gamma-ray emissions for 24,000 years. The storyline is similar to what Martin Heidegger says about poetry and technology and tools. The more technology you have, the more words you have, the more worlding you do with your hammer, to which everything looks like a nail, the more of what he calls earth emerges out of the world like an unprimed canvas glimpsed beneath the globs of paint. The more you have of systems, interrelation, meshwork, webs, pick your metaphor, the more you have of that. Let Fry and Laurie explain. It's rather wonderful how predictively the sketch moves from structuralism through deconstruction and finally to object-oriented ontology, and that was in 1989.
So let's talk instead about flexibility of language, linguistic elasticity, if you like.
Yes, I think I said earlier that our language, English...
As spoken by us.
As we speak it, yes, certainly, defines it. We are defined by our language, if you will.
Hello, we're talking about language.
Perhaps I can illustrate my point. Let me at least try. Here's a question.
What is it?
Well, my question is this. Is our language, English, capable? Is English capable of sustaining demagoguery?
Demagoguery?
Demagoguery.
And by demagoguery you mean?
By demagoguery I mean demagoguery.
I thought so.
I mean, highly charged oratory, persuasive whipping up rhetoric. Listen to me, listen to me. If Hitler had been British, would we, under similar circumstances, have been moved, charged up, fired up by his inflammatory speeches, or would we simply have laughed? Is English too ironic to sustain Hitlerian styles? Would his language simply have rung false in our ears?
We're talking about things ringing false in our ears.
May I compartmentalise? I hate to, but may I? May I? Is our language a function of our British cynicism, tolerance, resistance to false emotion, humour, and so on? Or do those qualities come extrinsically from the language itself? It's a chicken and egg problem.
We're talking about chickens, we're talking about eggs.
Let me start a leverette here. There's language and there's speech. There's chess and there's a game of chess. Mark the difference for me. Mark it, please.
We've moved on to chess.
Imagine a piano keyboard. 88 keys, only 88, and yet hundreds of new melodies, new tunes, new harmonies are being composed upon hundreds of different keyboards every day in Dorset alone. Our language, Tiger, our language, hundreds of thousands of available words, trillions of legitimate new ideas, so that I can say the following sentence and be utterly sure that nobody has ever said it before in the history of human communication. Hold the newsreader's nose squarely, waiter, or friendly milk will countermand my trousers. Perfectly ordinary words, but never before put in that precise order. A unique child delivered of a unique mother. And yet, we all of us spend all our days saying to each other the same things time after weary time. I love you, don't go in there, get out, you have no right to say that, stop it, why should I, that hurt, help, Marjorie is dead. That surely is a thought to take out for a cream tea on a raining sunny afternoon.
So to you, language is more than just a means of communication?
Oh, of course it is, of course it is, of course it is, of course it is. Language is my mother, my father, my husband, my brother, my sister, my whore, my mistress, my checkout girl. Language is a complimentary moist lemon-scented cleansing square or handy freshen-up white pet. Language is the breath of God. Language is the dew on a fresh apple. It's the soft rain of dust that falls into a shaft of morning light as you pluck from an old bookshelf a half-forgotten book of erotic memoirs. Language is the creak on a stair. It's a spluttering match held to a frosted pane. It's a half-remembered childhood birthday party. It's the warm, wet, trusting touch of a leaking nappy, the hulk of a charred panzer, the underside of a granite boulder, the first downy growth on the upper lip of a Mediterranean girl. It's cobwebs long since overrun by an old Wellington boot.
No night.
It's cobwebs long since overrun by an old Wellington boot. With this last phrase, Stephen Fry deftly evokes the way language can spin worlds, but he also evokes the emergence of objects out of, in spite of, the web of language, cobwebs of language, overrun by the very boot they seem to be masking, revealing, signifying, like Francis Bacon's Unprimed Canvas. I'm here today to talk about that old Wellington boot. It's odd, this emergence, isn't it? Odd to say the least. Slightly disturbing. We aren't primed for it. It's as if in the process of trying to understand something, the very tools you use to understand it acted as a kind of summoning spell. The spell makes materialize in front of you a very strange entity, whose parts are massively distributed in space-time. You can only see certain fragments at any moment, but you know it's there. You can infer the fragments from your systems thinking. It's a horror movie plotline, this emergence of hyperobjects. You thought you were optimizing your control of the environment and your understanding of reality, when in fact you were summoning a demon. You thought you were reducing objects to their relations, deconstructing entities with boundaries into open-ended nodes in a grid of negative difference, when in fact you were allowing your human eyes to widen just enough to glimpse what Percy Shelley calls the awful shadow of some unseen power. You thought you were delineating a mesh of total interconnectedness when really you were hooking up a hotline to the strange stranger. The hyperobjects become even more strange than this. This is for the simple reason that hyperobjects are not some far-out, distant being floating in the void like Cthulhu in Lovecraft's horror stories. No, these entities are in us. To some extent they are us. Your body contains thousands of symbionts without whom you would cease to exist. We've all absorbed all kinds of radiation from nuclear materials. Global warming doesn't stop at the stratosphere, or at the coastline, or at the Thames barrier. It comes right through your front door, into your air conditioning and heating system, into the tailpipe of your car. First, I'm going to argue that hyperobjects are foreshortened in time. Einstein's discovery of space-time was the discovery of a hyperobject, the way in which mass, as such, grips space, distorting it from within, stretching space and time into halls and vortices. For Einstein, entities, which may or may not include living observers, comprise indivisible world tubes. Each world tube encounters a fundamentally different universe depending on its mass and velocity. By world tube, relativity theory means to include the apprehending aspect of an entity with its entative aspect. A world tube is a hyperobject, that is, world tubes stretch and snap our ideas of what an object is in the first place. But not only our ideas, world tubes recede from other world tubes in an inescapable and irreducible way. There are two main reasons for this. One, light rays bouncing off an object only exert an influence within what Hermann Minkowski, the mathematician who proved relative theory geometrically, calls the light cone. There's an absolute past and an absolute future relative to any reference frame, a concept that approaches Derrida's idea of l'avenir. Relativity limits prediction to the light cone. That is, for every object in the universe there is a genuinely future that is radically unknowable. There is a genuinely elsewhere that is radically unknowable. Yet the future and the elsewhere exist. They are, in my terminology, strange strangers, knowable yet uncanny. 2. When we examine a world tube up close, it has all kinds of strange properties. This is because time ripples and melts along its surface, so that sensual interactions between one tube and another tube are always melting and dripping, rather than rigid and uniform. Thus time and space aren't physically real. Rather, physical events are real because they contain time and space in their interior, an argument of Einstein's that Graham Harman does in another way. Only infinitesimally small areas of space-time may be regarded as Galilean, that is, as rigid and container-like. The Einsteinian object isn't a unity at a small enough resolution, for instance. Thus, it is not possible in relativity to obtain a consistent definition of an extended rigid body, because this would imply signals faster than light. That means that the pencil you are holding in your hands is only a rigid extended body on account of a false immediacy. Nothing in the universe apprehends the pencil like that, really. Not even the pencil apprehends itself like that. The physical universe consists of objects that are more like turbulence in a stream than gooey or hard, extended bodies. A world tube, with its irreducible past and future, is a withdrawn object. Relativity positively guarantees that objects will be forever withdrawn from any object that tries to access them, including those objects themselves. And general relativity gives us the most obviously withdrawn object of all, the black hole. Hyperobjects envelop us, yet they are so massively distributed in time that they seem to taper off like a long street stretched into the distance. Time bends them and flattens them, the same way that an electromagnetic wave front actually shortens at its leading edge. Hyperobjects are foreshortened in time, just like objects in a perspective painting are foreshortened in space. Because we can't see to the end of them, hyperobjects are necessarily uncanny. Like the empty streets and open doorways in the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico, hyperobjects seem to beckon us further into themselves, making us realize that we're already lost inside them. This recognition of being caught in and by hyperobjects is precisely a feeling of the Freudian uncanny, a feeling of strange familiarity and familiar strangeness. We already know the weather like the back of our hand, but this is weird weather, this global warming weather. We already know light, but this is weird light, this radiation. Levi Bryant, exploring hyperobjects in a recent blog post, describes it thus. Hyperobjects are thus like our experience of a pool while swimming. Everywhere we are submersed within the pool, everywhere the cool water caresses our body as we move through it, yet we're nonetheless independent of the water. We produce effects in the water like diffraction patterns, causing it to ripple in particular ways, and it produces effects in us, causing our skin to get goosebumps. Space can thus no longer be construed as an absolute container, but as a space-time manifold that is radically in the universe, of it, rather than ontologically outside it. Space-time turns from a grid-like box into what Einstein fantastically calls a reference mollusk. Reference mollusks exist precisely because of hyperobjects that emanate gravitational fields. In these fields, geometry isn't Euclidean. In an age without computer graphics that could morph a grid into rippling, swelling hollows and bumps, Einstein turns to the most squishy thing he can imagine. But I rather think we should bring back the mollusks. Hyperobjects aren't infinitesimally small, thus they have Gaussian coordinates rather than Euclidean ones. Hyperobjects are time-squished. To this extent, H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu is a hyperobject, a giant squid-like being floating asleep in a non-Euclidean realm out there in the universe. Our ecological devastation has summoned these Cthulhu-like hyperobjects to terrorize us. Like all objects, hyperobjects compel us to handle them in certain ways. They exert what Alfonso Lingis calls the imperative, but because of temporal foreshortening, hyperobjects are impossible to handle just right. This aporia gives rise to a dilemma. We have no time to learn fully about hyperobjects, but we have to handle them anyway. This imperative has a term. Hyperobjects are viscous. They stick to you, and the stickiness has a strange property. The more you try to shake it off, to achieve some kind of conceptual distance towards it, the more it sticks to you, like the story of Anansi and the tar baby. In your struggle to achieve conceptual distance, you find out more about them. What do you find out? You find out how they affect more corners of your life. Knowledge is unable to achieve escape velocity from Earth. The paint is unable to transcend the canvas it's stuck on. Hyperobjects eat knowledge. This is a truly astounding discovery, and it's strange in itself that we're not more astounded by it on a daily basis. The more we seem to try to transcend the world with our knowledge and technology and instrumentality, the more we realize in the very same process that we are riveted to the spot. The search for a transcendental beyond, whether Kantian or Schopenhauerian or Nietzschean or even Heideggerian, the Hegelian positing of an absolute, or the Whiteheadian positing of a dynamic creativity that flows through everything like wax in a lava lamp. Every form of reductionism or transcendentalism or phenomenological positing of transcendent Dasein, all that, the last 200 years of it, become the roaring sounds of a jet engine without wheels or wings, the screeching of a tangly sculpture slowly dismantling itself in an art gallery. As goes philosophy, so goes science and technology. The Large Hadron Collider can break particles down by smashing them at close to light speed. Computers using terabytes of RAM can map the entire Earth's climate in real time. We can draw an IBM logo on the surface of some atoms. Massively distributed computing systems can process information at transhuman speeds. We could describe these procedures as, on the one hand, undermining, breaking things down into smaller things, and overmining, dissolving them upwards into holistic aggregates and patterns and systems. I'm using terms developed by Graham Harman. But hilariously, the more we undermine and overmine, the more actual, discrete, opaque, resilient, massive chunks of objects hove into view. That's not all, folks. The undermining and overmining processes, and we could also describe the last 200 years of philosophy in terms of this oscillation between breaking down and dissolving up, these very processes themselves are what give birth to our contact with the hyperobjects. They let us see these huge Titanic-like forms floating at the bottom of our conceptual ocean, these tips of gigantic icebergs sticking nonchalantly out of the surface of our probing and testing. Meanwhile, capitalism, with its utilitarian reductionism, undermining, and its Christian resonance machines, overmining, amplifying and broadcasting its message, I'm thinking here of William Connolly's work, promise us a pot of gold tomorrow, next year, after we retire, at the end of the rainbow, over there, in the stock market, in the ticker below the news, after the headlines in the financial report, over yonder in the bank, in the circulation of products, in the accumulation of value. Capital is elsewhere, the elsewhereing of value. Careless of the here and now, George Bush II tripped into Iraq and tried to flip the Armageddon switch. But I'm happy to say that the objects have saved us. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have exited modernity. Phew! And it's not the end of history. This is just the beginning, the moment of aperture when we wonder, has this started yet? How many chapters are there? Is there a lead character? Who's narrating this story? Think about how we wonder whether global warming has begun or not. That's how you can tell it has begun. Bad news, but good news insofar as it means that modernity is over, and by that I also mean post-modernity. I'm here today with good news, I think. Our position vis-à-vis these objects is like trying to get closer to the moon by running towards it, all the while forgetting that you're on the surface of the Earth. The viscosity is a direct product of increasing information. The more data we have about hyperobjects, the less we know about them, the more we realize we can never truly know them. This is a very curious phenomenon, one that confirms my suspicion that we have entered an ecological era. A few moments ago we were delighting on our ironic free play. Now it seems we're stuck to the mirror, like Neo in that scene in The Matrix. The sticking occurs as a function of our attempt to realize the dream of progress, to see ourselves in the mirror of the end of history. Our very attempt to achieve escape velocity from our physical and biological being has resulted in being stuck to the Earth. Rather than the total disintegration of the subject a la Frederick Jameson, or the vertiginous freedom of deconstruction, what we have is the creepy awareness that we are stuck to objects, forever. We can't unknow what we know. What we end up with is a situation in which it becomes impossible to maintain any kind of aesthetic distance. This distance is the main factor in producing the concept nature. So the curious phenomenon arises in which nature dissolves just as hyperobjects start to ooze uncannily around us. Objects in mirror are closer than they appear. Viscosity is what compels us, what puts us in that zone of the imperative. In this zone, choice is not the theatre of moral action. The viscosity of hyperobjects haunts us. It looms into our social, psychic, and ecological space, or rather we discover that it was already looming. Ontologically and temporally prior to our conceptual probing, hyperobjects are here already, like the ghosts in The Sixth Sense. Quantum objects are viscous. Complementarity means that when you nudge a quantum, it sticks to the nudging device so that you can't disentangle them. Rather than dissolving objects into nothingness, quantum theory makes them sticky. If you stretch this stickiness, how far would it go? This brings us to our next point. I'm using non-locality as a metaphor here. Right now, actual non-locality, quantum non-locality, can only be detected in very small objects such as photons and electrons, though some people have produced them in much larger scale objects such as a tiny tuning fork 30 microns long. That's a huge size from a photon's point of view, but it's pretty small from a human architectural point of view. An entanglement, what happens because of non-locality, has been observed in photosynthesizing molecules. The photon goes in and occupies several places simultaneously, and possibly in DNA. Quantum objects are massively distributed both in a conventional sense, yet still extraordinary sense, and in a highly unconventional sense. First, the roughly conventional. On Debris' view, for instance, a wave packet is a blob that contains something like a particle distributed in the wave packet across a range of locations according to probability. The wave packet may be imagined as a distributed across a vast area of space-time. Now consider non-locality. In ecosystems, things are contiguous and symbiotic. In non-locality, things directly are other things. A la aspect, Einstein's student David Bohm, Anton Zeilinger and others have shown that the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox concerning quantum theory is an empirical fact. Einstein, Rosen and Podolsky argued that if quantum theory were telling us something true about the universe, then you would be able to entangle particles. You could send one particle and some information, that is, make it spin in a certain way, and the other would instantaneously appear to have received the same information. This works to an arbitrary distance. Arbitrary here means 2 yards, 2 miles, the other side of the galaxy. Zeilinger has demonstrated non-local phenomena using entangled particles on either side of Vienna, between two Canary Islands, and between orbiting satellites. To explain non-locality, you could abolish the speed of light, but this troubles physicists. Or you could say that there aren't really two particles. It sounds mad, but the other options are more so. They involve time travel and telepathy. Non-locality means something is profoundly wrong with atomism. Moreover, objects have blurred boundaries at scales considerably larger than we used to think. Photosynthesizing molecules in chloroplasts, the symbiotic bacteria that make plants green, put photons into coherence. When it enters the molecule, a photon occupies many positions at once. To those great Victorian period discoveries, then, evolution, capital, the unconscious, we must now add space-time, ecological interconnection, giving rise to global warming, for instance, and non-locality. These discoveries all share something, insofar as they humiliate the human, decisively decentering us from a place of pampered privilege in the scheme of things. Non-locality is perhaps the most drastic of all these, since it implies that the notion of being located at all is only epiphenomenal to a deeper, more atemporal implicate order. But I'm going to argue here that all the hyperobjects are kind of non-local. Stop the tape of evolution anywhere, and you won't see it. Stand under a rain cloud and it's not global warming you'll feel falling on your head. Cut your coat into 1,000 pieces, you won't find capital in there. Now try pointing to the unconscious. Did you catch it? Now try to point at a world tube. Same problem, right? Hyperobjects compel us to think ecologically and not the other way around. Ecological awareness is a product of hyperobjects. It's not as if some abstract environmental system made us think like this. Plutonium, global warming, pollution and so on gave rise to ecological thinking. When you feel raindrops falling on your head, you are experiencing climate in some sense. In particular, you are experiencing the climate change known as global warming, but you are never directly experiencing global warming as such. Nowhere in the long list of catastrophic weather events, which will increase as global warming takes off, will you find global warming. But global warming is as real as this sentence. Not only that, it's viscous. It never stops sticking to you, no matter where you move on planet Earth. How can we account for this? By arguing that global warming, like all hyperobjects, is non-local. It's massively distributed in time and space. What does this mean? It means that my experience of the weather in the hic et nunc is a false immediacy. It's never the case that those raindrops only fall on my head. They are always a manifestation of global warming. In an age of ecological emergency, in an age in which hyperobjects start to oppress us with their terrifying strangeness, we will have to get used to the fact that locality is always a false immediacy. Hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space. In other words, we can only see pieces of them at a time. The reason why they appear non-local and temporally foreshortened is precisely because of this transdimensional quality. If an apple were to invade a 2D world, first the stick people would see some dots as the bottom of the apple touched their universe. Then a rapid succession of shapes would appear like an expanding and contracting circular blob, diminishing to a tiny circle, possibly a point, and disappearing. What we experience as a lava lamp fluidity, flowing and oozing metaphors abound in the new materialism, for instance, is precisely a symptom of our less than adequate perception of higher dimensions of structure, which is where the hyperobjects live. That's why you can't see global warming. You would have to occupy some high-dimensional space to see it unfolding explicitly. Think of a daffodil. A daffodil flower is a three-dimensional map of an algorithm executed by DNA and RNA in the daffodil's genome. The tips of the crinkly stem show the latest state of the algorithm's unfolding in 3D space. The base of the flower is a plot of the beginnings of the flower algorithm. Your face is a map of everything that happened to it. Now think of global warming. We only see snapshots of what is actually a very complex plot of a super complex set of algorithms executing themselves in a high-dimensional phase space. When the weather falls on your head, you're experiencing a bad photocopy of a piece of that plot. What you once thought was real turns out to be a sensual representation, a thin slice of an image, a caricature of a piece of global climate. Thinking of things as nature is thinking of them as more or less static or metastable, continuity bounded by time and space. The classic image of nature is the romantic or picturesque painting of a landscape. There it is, over yonder, on the wall or in the gallery. And it has over yonderness encoded throughout it. Look at those distant hills. that branch suggesting that we follow the perspective lines towards the vanishing point, and so on. Then I suppose we could animate this picture and produce some kind of oozing, flowing, lava-lampy version of the same thing. I'm quite suspicious of these new and improved versions of nature, which simply turn the static picture into a flowing picture. Something remains the same. This would be the sense of time as a container. The picture appears complex, cinematic, Deleuzian. Deleuze theorizes cinema beautifully. No accident. But this kind of cinematic flow had already been anticipated in the Romantic period. In an age before the silver screen, huge swathes of blank verse narrating the flow of the subject opened up an ideological space in which cinema could appear. Wordsworth is the first cinematic artist. The cool theorists of this kind of process relationism, as it's called, Whitehead, Deleuze, don't really explain time. Time is a liquid in which the image melts and flows. It's very cool, possibly retro-cool, I don't know. But the best it can do is to track hyperobjects. Think of that movie about Burtinsky, Manufactured Landscapes. The camera tracks processes of production and the piling of e-waste and so on. The pathos of that incredible opening shot is precisely the pathos of a gaze floating through time. We have no idea when the shot will finish, and concurrently just how enormous the factory is. From cinema we move to plots and maps of algorithms in phase space. This is what enormously powerful processors can now do when they map climate. Now, what the software is really seeing really does exit from the world of the aesthetic container and aesthetic distance, since we're no longer dealing with time or space as containers, but including time and space as dimensions of the high-dimensional phase space. Time is now radically inside objects, rippling through them, as I argued a while back, and space is inside objects, differentiating their parts from one from the other. The trouble is, of course, that we're not seeing it ourselves anymore. Computers see it for us then we see the data or slices of that phase space rendered in some way to make it usable. The panic and denial and right-wing absurdity about global warming is entirely justified. The whole thing, from the phenomenon itself to the ways which we have to see it, or rather have it seen, are profoundly threatening to individualism, nationalism, anti-intellectualism, racism, speciesism, anthropocentrism, you name it. Possibly even capitalism itself. We'll see fairly shortly whether capitalism is up for the job.
That's it, thank you. The next person to speak on the ecological panel is Jon Goodbun. Jon Goodbun is about to complete, I think, his PhD. He has research interests ranging across a network of architecture, process philosophy, radical cybernetics, urban political ecology, and the natural and cognitive science. He says he sometimes refers to himself as a metropolitan technologist. For want of a better description, he focuses on the near and medium-term future scenarios. He is based in the School of Architecture and Built Environment, which is at Westminster University, where he teaches design, theory, and research. He is also a regular contributor and critique to other schools like here at the AA, the RCA, Greenwich, UCA at Canterbury, Brighton, and Bartlett. He's also the founding partner of an architecture and design practice, which is called WAG, and also he's engaged in various art, design, and research projects. Let's welcome Jon Goodbun.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed the presentation enormously. There's going to be quite a few crossovers, hopefully. I'm aware of the tight time scale, so I'll try to read straight from the paper. So in this paper, in the title of this paper, I'm referring to a collection of essays that Gregory Bateson published in 1972. It's called Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And in this collection, Bateson brought together a range of material from across his widely and wildly transdisciplinary career. The steps in his title have a double meaning, referring both to a walk through his own personal history and, to some extent, his own conception of mind as an ecological phenomena, but also refers to the cybernetic concept of step changes, which describes how layers of organisational wholes emerge within organised systems, which has an enormous degree of similarity with what actually Morton refers to as hyper-objects, the emergence of organisational wholes. For Bateson, the ecology of the living world is a relational differential system, full of mind or full of minds. These are minds that are constituted in networks through their activity, their actual life process. Bateson sees ecosystems as ecologies of minds. He also sees organisms as ecologies of minds. Human consciousness for Bateson is extended across and within these social and cultural ecologies, such as language, as an ecological condition itself, and is not in any simple way located in the individual brain. Bateson's work, like that of several of his colleagues involved in the more radical wing of cybernetic research, anticipated by many decades the recent turn within the cognitive sciences towards various conceptions of embodied and extended mind. Let's just say, I mean, the history of cybernetics has been incredibly badly written, and it's often, in the series of criticisms of it in the 90s, was seen as a kind of disembodied concept, and elements of it were, but there was a radical wing within cybernetics which was distinctly and profoundly embodied, and that's the turn that cognitive science has made in recent years. So, for Bateson, we are constantly participating in cognitive systems that extend throughout our environment. And he's not being metaphorical, he's being quite literal. He stated, dramatically prefiguring Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis in various ways, although there are big differences as well, that the individual mind is immanent, but not only in the body. It is immanent also in the pathways and messages outside of the body. And there is a larger mind of which the individual mind is only a subsystem. This larger mind is immanent still in the total interconnected social system and planetary ecology. For Bateson, the fact that our minds are ecologically extended allowed him to propose a powerful thesis regarding the effects of environments upon the human psyche, and a radical reformulation of environmental damage as a form of mental pathology. Using the case of Lake Erie, whose ecosystem was in a state of collapse, as Bateson wrote, he suggested that if you decide that you want to get rid of the byproducts of human life, and that Lake Erie would be a good place to put them, you forget that the eco-mental system called Lake Erie is part of your wider eco-mental system, and that if Lake Erie is driven insane, its insanity is incorporated into the larger system of your thought and experience. I'll return to discuss Bateson further later, but these quotes in his radical and today increasingly prescient account of embodied, extended and ecological mind immediately raises the stakes, if that is possible, for us in regard to the environmental question as eco-mental entities or agencies ourselves. Today, the effects of human economic activity upon the planet have never been greater or clearer. This is just today's front page from The Independent, which we might think of in the terms of Bateson set out a moment ago. However, as soon as we try to conceive of our condition, whether philosophically, politically, or as designers, artists and architects, we are compelled to draw upon a series of existing discourses and concepts, including, for example, ecology, nature, culture, technology, organic, environment, etc. Without exception, all of these terms have complex histories and carry all kinds of formidable ideological baggage. We do need to work with all of these conceptual histories. I don't think that we can leave any terms aside. Whilst I've got an enormous amount of sympathy with Morton's work, I don't think that we're in a position where we can simply move beyond the concept of nature yet. Although I can see the point of playing out that position. We need to work with all of these conceptual histories, but in a critical and self-reflexive manner, in the manner of the Frankfurt School, in a sense, and developing these terms in new directions for new tasks, and developing new terms too. And so again, I've got great sympathy with trying to develop new concepts like hyperobjects. Now what I'm doing is giving a kind of snapshot of bits of PhD work, and actually kind of this is sort of 4 steps, if you like. Relational process, that's actually an enormous amount of what Morton just spoke about, and David Bohm was the quantum physicist that he referred to. Bohm suggested we need to stop using the term quantum mechanics, and quantum organism would be a better description of the science they were producing. Bateson I've just given you an introduction to, and I'll talk later about his ecological aesthetics. Radical cybernetics was a particular form, a completely different way of actually performing science, both Bateson's ecological aesthetics and the kind of radical strand of cybernetics are both actually a kind of performative engagements with the world, which I think offer models for practice. And at the other end of the scale, urban political ecology, which basically has come out of a group of Marxist geographers, people like David Harvey, Neil Smith, and Eric Schwingerdahl. I'm going to make mentions to all of those, but obviously in the space there's no chance of giving any full account of this. The one that I actually pretty much left out is the shift away from a kind of particle-based metaphysics towards a process-based thing, and that's actually what Morton gave the greatest account of, so that kind of meets up well. Okay, the process of productively engaging, reworking, extended these concepts, all the problematic ones, nature, etc., I mentioned a moment ago, requires transdisciplinary research, drawing upon moments from the histories of the natural sciences, but also much art-based research. It requires knowledge of the various components of systems theory, but also the more experimental nomadic science of radical cybernetics. It draws upon all kinds of contemporary developments within the cognitive sciences, but also requires critical geography and urban political ecology. Architectural and art-based knowledge has much to contribute to the reimagining of our metabolic relations to the world, and indeed a reimagining of the world as itself an unfolding process rather than linear causal object. So again, Morton's just done that. But equally, it must transform itself through new forms of design activism. We are living through an extraordinary period in many respects. We are told that we are dominated by free markets, yet as the food systems expert Tim Lang and the philosopher Frederick Jameson have both observed, multinational corporations such as Tesco's and Walmart are organising planned economies at a level of scale and sophistication that the old Soviet Union could never even have dreamed of. We're not actually in a free market situation at all, we're in a very sophisticated planned market situation. The challenge, of course, our problem is that these privately planned economies are obscure, undemocratic and unsustainable. The very concept of planning, at an urban level especially, has, it seems, never been weaker, even whilst what is at stake in planning and the need for conscious awareness and democratic political participation in it has never been greater. The project of formulating transdisciplinary research around design ecology or urban ecology or whatever term you want to use to try and describe the kind of need for this new professional transdisciplinary nexus of thought must ultimately aim to contribute to the reimagining of the political project of planning in the built environment in the 21st century in some way, I would say. Understanding social, economic, ecological systems in relation to social justice has become a key task of urban political ecology, perhaps the most important extension of ecological theory to have emerged in recent years. In this paper, I can do little more than note some of the precursors of contemporary urban political ecology in the basic relations between ecology, economics, and the architectural urban. In particular, I will turn to consider the thinking again of Gregory Bateson, in whose work we find one of the most innovative and important reconceptions of the overall project of ecology. And I will suggest that the work of this maverick thinker and the group of nomadic cyberneticians around him have important contributions to make to actually extending urban political ecology today. And at the moment, these two groups aren't, or bodies of knowledge don't particularly come together. Obviously, I can't do this in much more cursory way, so I'm just going to actually take a few steps through revealing some of the problems within the conceptual terms we have. So, in his seminal book Keywords, Raymond Williams suggests that nature is perhaps, and I quote, is perhaps the most complex word in the language. Adrian Forty has also argued that and I quote, for most of the last 500 years, nature has been the main, if not the principal category for organising thought about what architecture is or might be. I can't talk through this, but it's just some of the ways in which nature as a kind of concept is figured within architectural projects over in different periods. This is no surprise, since throughout this period architecture has mediated the extended metabolic interface of a social, spatial, economic and symbolic between the external non-human world and the human world. Marxian theorists have noticed that under capitalism the concept of nature has frequently been defined in opposition to the concept of culture. Harvey, for example, notes that one of the big problems that has arisen in the bourgeois era has been precisely the way in which conceptually, and also through practices and social institutions, we've increasingly seen nature as something over there and society as something over here. Neil Smith has similarly noted that when we eventually look back at the intellectual shibboleths of the high capitalist period, say the last 3 centuries, few ingrained assumptions will look so wrong-headed or so globally destructive as the common sense separation of society and nature. Historically and geographically, most societies have avoided such stark presumptions of hubristic folly, but from physicists to sociologists, physicians to poets, the brains of the ascendant capitalist West not only embraced but made a virtue out of society's separation from nature. Other terms here are just as complex and problematic as nature and culture. The organic has a particularly profound, difficult political set of meanings and a complex set of everyday uses, but again, I don't think we can simply move beyond it yet. The organic, in fact, originally refers to mechanical machines and only later referred to what we now think of as organisms and that whole set of meanings. And that happened through a metaphoric transferal that in fact started in the imagining of organisms to be machine-like. And that, incidentally, that meaning is preserved in the musical organ, the original meaning. However, just because these terms are complex do not mean that we can abandon them. As I said, I mean, and if we were to do that, if we were to abandon nature, we'd actually abandon the concept of culture. If we abandon the concept of the organic, we abandon the concept of technology. We actually just need to self-reflexively work through these and perform a constant ideological critique as we work. Morton, as we've seen, kind of has pinned some hopes on the concept of ecology, and I guess many of us do, but ecology too is an exceptionally complex term, no less so than nature. The term emerged into popular consciousness in the 60s as a byword for radical, holistic and systemic thinking, and has returned to prominence in recent years in all kinds of fields, once again as a way of signalling an attempt to engage with both broader environmental questions and various modes of relational, process and systems-based theory and philosophy. In many respects, ecology as a concept has even more baggage than nature or the organic, and if we want to use it as a conceptual framework, then we need to work through these. As a discourse, ecology has incredibly complicated and contradictory roots. It does exist as a hard science, as a hard scientific discipline, yet it also has allegiances with the environmental movement and ecocentric theory in a wider sense that give it an irreducible complexity, combining many of the insights of modern science, but mixed together with intellectual, religious, romantic legacies, ideas and practices that are from beyond the Enlightenment, either predating it and or from remote cultures. And this gives ecological theory, I mean, in many ways it gives it an enormous kind of power and resourcefulness, but it's equally, very problematic. For example, ecological thinkers might typically and not unreasonably assert that the Western scientific method, as traditionally produced in the Enlightenment, promotes Promethean views of the non-human world as something to be exploited and experimented upon. But they'll then go on to cite scientific evidence from that very tradition as proof of that damage. The word ecology itself is derived from the Greek oikos, meaning household, and ecology can then be translated as both the science of running a home and the science of running an economy. Ecology internalises many of the same complex contradictions that characterise modern architectural knowledge and practice, in fact. The theme that ecology shares with the economic is much more than a shared etymology. In important ways, much ecological theory, certainly as it was developed as a hard science in the 20th century, can be thought of quite simply as an economics of nature. Ecology was right from the start a body of knowledge that developed in an applied sense as well, as a means of managing the integration, expansion of the capitalist economy into non-human ecologies and economies. Ecology as a profession was one of a series of disciplines that co-emerged at the metabolic interface of capitalist production and the planet in the 18th and 19th centuries. Donald Worcester has suggested that the first science, that ecology has both Arcadian and imperialist roots, simultaneously Arcadian and imperialist roots. There's this double tradition. For example, amongst the first scientists to be employed in an explicitly ecological capacity were those of the Dutch and East India trading companies in the late 18th century. These companies, which encompassed everything from colonial government to managing both local landscapes and global trade flows, meant that they were consciously confronting the needs for systems thinking at the leading edge of capitalist development at the time. So just in summary, we can, the range of complex meanings that are attached to ecology would include a non-reductive science of relations, relationality, a form of systems thinking or cybernetics. I mean, they absolutely co-emerge together, and people like Bateson and a whole series, I think, has moved between the two, all of those. A site of political struggle over the environment, its core meaning of running a home, the science of running a home or running an economy, and its essential practice as an economics of nature. But I also agree with Morton that I think we can invest more in this term than the others, but it's certainly no less problematic than nature. Okay, so in the work of Gregory Bateson, in fact, going back to how I started, we can find one of the most innovative and important reconceptions of the overall project of ecology. And Bateson was very critical of his colleagues in many ways. Primarily, I refer to Gregory Bateson's project of ecological aesthetics that developed later in his life, a self-reflexive criticism of systems theory's tendency to talk solely in terms of optimization, efficiency, control, and so on. For Bateson, the locus of ecologists and systems theorists, the focus, of ecologists and system theorists primarily on energy and material flows in ecological science was problematic, and for two reasons. Firstly, he considered that ecosystems had to be considered to be communicating and informational systems, in parallel to thinking of them as material and energetic systems. Ecologists were, he said, overemphasizing energy exchanging and tending insufficiently to information exchange. And the kind of, a sort of simple illustration of that would be just in a sort of system of turning a tap on, in the sense that there's a force required to turn a tap on, but that then opens another flow. So a force of turning a tap on, that's an energy force itself, but it's acting in an informational way upon what might flow through a pipe. And the point is that network systems, ecological systems, are wholly doing that. And ecological science, as it was produced kind of as a capitalist tool for managing the environment, was tending to simply focus on material and energy flows, and still does to this day. And Bateson was saying, well, if we grasp these flows as embodied information, we immediately just see ourselves as part of that system. It's a way to kind of a kind of epistemological politics or something, I guess you might call it. Sergio Mangi has argued that the ecological language created by Bateson, in particular starting in the 1960s, has to be considered one of the most important attempts of the 20th century to rethink the human condition in the planetary era. It was an attempt to explore in depth our being part of larger systems, interpersonal, social, and natural. Now, I've also referred to what Andrew Pickering has described as the ontological theatre that was staged by the group of radical cyberneticians around Bateson. And that group would include Stafford Beer, Gordon Pask, Ronnie Lang, Ross Ashby, and Grey Water, amongst others. And Pickering makes very recently published book, The Cybernetic Brain, which I'd recommend, draws a very similar history to the one I've drawn out of this body of work. And Pickering simply argues that the cybernetics, or the particular form of it, as opposed to a kind of instrumentalized systems theory, is better described as anti-control, a project that stages, in his words, an ontology of becoming that draws back the veil the modern sciences have cast over the performative aspects of the world, including our own being. For Pickering, drawing upon Heidegger's discussion of technology, while systems theories can easily be instrumentalized within framing, as a particular forms of cybernetic practice actually staged experimental open-ended research into revealing what it might be to be human at individual, collective and ecological levels. And I think trying to explore and understand this history in this way actually sets up all kinds of ways in which we can practice experiments of revealing, I think, in a sense, and both ourselves and the world as kind of co-performative agents. Pickering was actually a quantum physicist originally, turned historian and theorist of science, and has written more broadly about the social forms of scientific practice and the effect of those forms upon the knowledge claims made by science. Importantly for Pickering, the ontology of cybernetics is a strange and unfamiliar one, so I quote there, very different from that of the modern sciences, end quote. He argues that the modern ideology of science is fundamentally representational and claims that the experimental work of radical cybernetics stages a non-representational approach, a hylozoic wonder and a reciprocal coupling of people and things. And it's a kind of performative engagement that I think can be found across these 4 steps that I'm trying to set up as an ecology of design to talk about today. It stages an understanding of science and indeed art as a mode of performative engagement in the world, or ontological theatre. In Pickering's account, we find a distinctive and radical outline for a new nomadic science or a new nomadic practice. And it's important to note, Bateson was incredibly, obviously the term nomadic science, nomadic practice is taken from Deleuze and Guattari, and Bateson was an absolutely foundational influence on Deleuze and Guattari, although not so often mentioned. Plateau was a term they took from Bateson. Bateson, amongst his various things he did with Ronnie Lang, was foundational in the anti-psychiatry movement, which obviously was of incredible importance to Guattari, and Guattari's 3 Ecologies is directly taken, and he opens with a quote from Bateson. So it's very, although it's incredible, it's very rarely written about this stuff actually. I think it's more useful for us actually to go back to Bateson than I think too much people have got lost in the world of D&G. In Pickering's account, finally, we find a distinctive and radical outline for new nomadic science, I say that. A forward-looking search for a vision not of a world characterised by graspable causes, but one in which reality is always in the making. There's a few kind of, what am I doing for time? So
2 more minutes.
A couple of minutes. There's just a couple of little things I can end on then. Just a picture of a shell. And Bateson had a intellectual exercise that he would set students, which was based upon a variation of the cybernetic concept of the black box. The black box concept in cybernetics being basically that we never have full access to the object. All we have are our relations to a given object, and we can study our relationality. It's another way of I guess, Morton's hyperobjects are just complex black boxes in a sense. And Bateson, this challenge, Bateson would present students with a series of shells like this. And I think it's basically presented with a challenge, which I think is a fascinating one that I'd recommend people try and do for themselves. He basically asked them to produce arguments that would convince him that this object is the remains of a living thing. And, well, I won't tell you how. There's kind of ways to go about it. I'm happy to discuss that later or whenever. But I'll put that forward as a useful way to start to grasp what ecological aesthetics might be. How is it that in these objects, what we're actually seeing, this is very much actually a kind of hyper-object in Morton's sense, I'd say. It's an accretion of various processes in space and time, and it has a particular recursive organisation that can only come from a certain level of organisation, and it's not to you don't need any concept of an Elan Vital or anything like that to think about this. You just need a concept of complexities of process. And so when the reason why Bohm, going back to sort of said that quantum mechanics is better understood as quantum organism, he was working directly with Whitehead, who I think Morton lumped Whitehead in with a bunch of others that I wouldn't necessarily do, and Whitehead made the point that quantum physics is a study of small organisms in much the same way that quantum biology is a smaller study of larger organisms. And so it's a question of degrees of recursive organisation, which is part of, as Bateson made clear, the locus of what we imagine to be self. Okay, I think I wasted 2 minutes there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, next up. Next up, I'm quite honoured to introduce you to Bruce McLean, who's a Scottish kind of performance artist and painter. McLean was born in Glasgow and studied at the Glasgow School of Art from 61 to 63 and St Martin's School of Art from 63 to 66, where Anthony Carroll took his sculpture class. In reaction to the attitude of the latter, he began making his sculpture from rubbish. He has gained an international recognition for his paintings, ceramics, prints, and work with film, theatre and books. McLean has been the head of the graduate painting at the Slade School of Fine Art, I think for probably the past 10 years.
I'm giving it up now.
It's stopped now, and he's focusing on his own new practice work. I've seen Testbed was the latest piece that I saw, which was a performance piece in Battersea, which is a really eclectic mix of a giant canvas, which was kind of live and things being played back onto it. So again, I'd just like to welcome Bruce McLean. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Shaun. Actually, I'm a sculptor, and I was quite interested to hear what you were saying about Frederick Kiesler. I was going to be an architect, but my father said I was too small and forbid it. And Frederick Kiesler was very small, and a lot of people have never heard of Frederick Kiesler because in the photographs of all the great architects, Duisburg and Gropius and stuff with big hats, you can just see him at the bottom of the picture. You have to look very carefully, but he's there. That's why he's been missed a lot, I think. Anyway, actually I'm a sculptor, and I have to say that most of my life has been involved in questioning that activity, which I'm still doing, and I've actually come to some conclusions lately, which I'll be presenting a little later on in the year, if you'll invite me back. Not today, I haven't quite concluded with these yet. I think you're going to leave me alone for a minute. I don't have a PhD, I don't have any O-levels, I'm really quite badly behaved really, and I'm not going to look at a computer, I'm going to look at you. Shut that, I think. And what I'm going to show is a few things. Basically, what is interesting is that because I was a sculptor, and I'm a sculptor, and was trained as a sculptor at St Martin's, and I had very, very rigorous training and questioning procedures, I actually got a job working in the sculpture department at Croydon School of Art, which is run by a failed architect. We hadn't passed his exams, called Dick Sladden, and he, in 1966 this was, in 66 we developed through the sculpture, because it was in a civil defence site in the landscape, we very quickly got involved in cloud art, rain art, mud arts, pollution art, all sorts of stuff, and the sculpture department turned into an environmental department. And there was only 2 environmental courses in the country, one at Hornsey and one at Croydon. And it was a very interesting area, and what has been talked about this morning is some of the stuff that was sort of talked about then. But we had a silent ethicist called Mathew Salvadori on the course. There was Gavin Bryars, the composer, was on the course teaching. I was teaching. There was a behavioural psychologist, Ed Taney, there was an ergonomicist, and there was a botanist, and there was a sociologist, and they were teaching sculpture in the sculpture department, which became the environmental department. And I won't bore you with the ins and outs of it, but the course went on, and nobody knew none of us knew what we were doing, nobody had a clue what was going on. We had all these books, Bates and Gordon Pask, we knew all these people, all sorts. It's just a complete mess. But in 1970, the course was closed. Just like that. Disappeared. Government decision, I suspect. Well, I don't suspect, I know it was. And interesting, it's all popped up again 40 years later. But a lot could have been done they allowed this thing to take place. The excuse for closing the course down was the students who were on the course, 2 went to the AA to study recyclable architecture studies or something here, and 1 became a brain surgeon, and 1 became a nuclear physicist. So they said, "This isn't. They're not sculptors. You're not training sculptors." And I said, "Well, you work with a brain. It's the same as working with a lump of clay, because clay has a memory like a brain. If you work with, so they weren't having any of that. It was just completely stuffed." And I've been a bit annoyed about that ever since, and I'm struggling with actually trying to make another course somewhere, a free course, free for the students. If anyone who is employed in there to work with the students will have to pay their own fees. That's the staff, I mean, not the students. And I'm working on that just now. Anyway, I'll just rattle through a few things here to show that what I'm kind of been doing, it might not bear any relationship to what you might think about the environment or quantum physics. I'm quite obsessed at the moment with flatness. I'm quite obsessed with 3 and 4 and 5th and 8th and 12th dimensions, but I'm mainly concerned with flatness. And I think that the title of the thing, the Unprimed Canvas, is quite curious. I do work a lot with paint, and I'm painting at the moment, and I'm painting from photographs and photographing paintings and photographing the painting of the photograph and the print of the photograph, and really messing around with it. I don't think I've got any of these photographs here. I might have, but I'm kind of still thinking about when I was making a sculpture in St. Martin. Somebody said, "That's too thin to be a sculpture." I said, "Well, if it's too thin to be a sculpture, it's too fat to be a painting." So there was quite a kind of problem about this, and I'm still pondering this as I speak. Actually, I'm making it up as I go along this, which, as an artist, you're allowed to do. Well, I think you are, and I use the word artist loosely. Artists are people who make art, and art is the one thing I really am not interested in at all. I'm interested in sculpture, I'm interested in buildings, I'm interested in environment, I'm interested in behaviour, all sorts of stuff. How do I make this thing work? Go to the next slide. That's why it's all being a bit stiff. Oh yeah, good. That's an installation of, it's in a house. I'm very concerned with where things are. This has made quite last 10 years. Don't look at the thing in the front. The thing behind is a picture of a poppy against 2 different coloured backgrounds. That's a bar with a sliding. I don't know if you can see it, but that long bar there is, you can put a drink on here and push a trolley, but slides along like an American bar. You can put a sausage on it, cheese roll, or a pint or something, and it whizzes along. Now, this is a bar designed in conjunction with Will Alsop for the Valencia Biennale. There we are in the bar. This is just a painting I made in a building with Alsop's practice down at I don't know, Whitechapel or something like that. And what the paintings are implanted into the building. This is a picture of 2 potatoes, peeled. I'm quite interested in potatoes, and I'm actually writing a book at the moment called The History of the Potato in Contemporary British Painting and Sculpture. It was mainly going to be about painting, but I actually realised that the one thing, I'm not very good at domestic chores, like dusting or hoovering or ironing, but I'm actually quite good at potato peeling and chopping sticks. But I've made a lot of potato sculptures and 1 or 2 potato paintings. I made a very early painting called A Potato Against a Black Background. In fact, that's what that performance piece that you saw at Rivet was called, A Potato Against a Dark Background. Well, I think the potato is a very interesting vegetable. Not necessarily as a chip. This is the Arnolfini bar revisited, which I remade. It's now been torn down. This is a model of a primary school I built in Scotland. I tried to build a school. I was having I think that what's interesting about the Unprimed Canvas thing. Can you hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Have you seen that film, The Last Temptation of Christ, by Martin Scorsese? Have you seen that? terrible film, isn't it? He says, "I'm the son of God. Can you hear me at the back? Can you?" Chap with big paper teeth. Anyway, I tried to make. I had this idea. I'm concerned about the idea of sculpture. I'm concerned about all this stuff. But what is interesting, what has been sort of talked about, is the kind of incidental. I'm interested in incidental incident. You were talking about this. You know, you set off to do one thing, and because you're doing one thing, it's the thing that it's all the flex under the table here, which is actually more interesting than the speakers. You know, you're saying, what is all this flex? This is the ecology of design. It's a fucking great tangle of crap. You know, it's like, it's unbelievably, I mean, it's quite visual. I'm interested in featured flex as a kind of an aesthetic, but it's completely nonsense. But so I'm interested in incidental. So the incidental, if I come here today, I'm going to get something out of this. I don't know what, but it won't be what I thought it was, I can assure you. And it's like so I was thinking about building this school, because I was invited to be the head of graduate painting at the Slade, and I suddenly realized that nobody knew anything. I was talking to students at the high end of the MA level of things, and they didn't know what perspective was or what all kind of visual, all sorts of things they didn't know anything about. So I thought, this is absolute crap. And they're paying enormous amounts of money to come and hear more crap from people like me. So I thought, well, it'd be quite interesting to build a primary school. When you go to a primary school, you have a fantastic time. And you leave the primary school and you go to secondary school, and they say, you're not having a good time here. This is real. This is the real world now. So you study, get these bloody A levels at A or B levels at B or whatever the hell they are, and then you go to university and they say, don't worry about all that A level crap and all that B level shit. You're in the real world now. You're doing a BA. And you get a BA and they say, oh, don't worry about that when you're doing an MA. That's crap. You do an MA now. This is the real thing. You do an MA, you have to do a PhD. Why is it called a PhD and not a PhA? Can you tell me that? Well, anyway, it's just like nonsense. So I thought, why not build a school where you go at the age of 6, not 5, 7, say. I think 7's early enough. And you go to the school and you stay there till you leave, or you don't leave. Or you go to school when you want to, but you're not going to somewhere else. You don't have any degrees or anything. It's absolute full of, it's a complete control and nonsense. So I decided to build this school, and I found this woman, headmistress in Scotland, a big woman like Margaret Dumont of the Marx Brothers film, smoking and drinking, and I liked her, and she said, I'll give you a hand with the school, let's do it, come on. But anyway, she couldn't break the law. It has to still be a primary school, but by building this primary school with embedded intelligence in it, not art, embedded intelligence made by artists and other people into the fabric of the building, I discovered that I'd made another venue for the dissemination of visuals, things, and other things, which wasn't a gallery like Bond Street or Cork Street. It wasn't a museum. It was a school. So then I thought, I built this school in the wrong place. This is completely ridiculous. I shouldn't have built the school in a field where it was a school. I should have built the school down the road where there was a great, unbelievable marine, a museum. You built the school over the museum. So you've got information there. So now I'm thinking that every city which has got a particular kind of museum should have a school built over that museum. So you go to Sheffield to look at whatever. So anyway, that's a model for the school. I didn't make that model because I'm slightly cat-handed, but I had it made for me. And it's all based on the number 7. And the idea about the school was that the 7 days in the week, the 7 holes in your head, the 7 colours in the rainbow, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7 goes all through the whole history of things. And primary itself is a 7-letter word. And the idea was that if you looked at the building, you could understand it was divisible into 7 bits of this. And the other idea was that everything in the school, if a student said, a pupil said, why is that table covered in that plastic? You could answer, it's covered in that plastic because, it's that height because, it's that window there because. It's not, and everything is a usable device for learning. It didn't quite work out like that because a lot of people thought I'd come up from London with a dream team, which annoyed me slightly. So they tried to screw it up, but I'm going to do another one. Don't worry, I'm coming back. So that's a sculpture of a pipe smoker, which has been removed. This is an installation for a hospital foyer. It's a healing garden. You go into the hostel, you meant to feel better, then you leave. You don't even go any further than that. This is one of the early models for the school with intelligence. Didn't look like that. This is. Can you read that text there? No. This is. I'm not going to read it out. I could read it out, but you'll all get terribly bored, and I haven't got the time that I'm going to be talking at the top there. Don't you think it's the most awful thing to see that you've got another 10 minutes to go? I hate performance art. If somebody goes and drinks some water, and then they walk around the table and they do it twice, you think they're going to do that again until I'm bloody bored shitless. Anyway, this here is a project which I worked on for a palace of arts. That building there at the end is a cheese building which was going to be designed by Oldenburg, and it's a whole building made of flats. It doesn't exist. It's flat. Just moves about like that. Anyway, it's cool. It was going to be all right. Facade Park. These are some. This is my proposal for the storehouse of art at the Tate. I've got a new building called the Tate Modern. It's a converted brick shithouse, a boiler. I don't know what's going on down there. It seems to be completely irrelevant for the decimation of what is around. I suppose it's for art, and that goes down there. But they have these storehouses, and they're full of. I wanted to build a storehouse of art so that you can go and stare at art in the storehouse, but you don't go around a blockbuster exhibition, creeping around the walls. You sit down with a large glass of something and the work goes past you. You can have a very slow Giacometti going past or a quick Andy Warhol. You can speed it up. Things you want to see quickly can go past quickly, and you can have 25 rows high. So I spoke to Nick Sirota and I said, look, I want to talk about this slightly again, this Tate thing. I spoke to Nick Sirota about this proposal. He's a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time, and he quite likes me, and I like him. But yeah, I said, what about... We'll build a storehouse, all the stuff's in the store, and somebody said, hey, we don't want to see that Mondrian again, we want to see a Georges Bontemps-Leroux, stick a Bontemps-Leroux on the conveyor belt. And he said, people that's not how you view art. And I said, well, if you go to Sotheby's, there's an easel there, and somebody puts a Cézanne on it, and everyone looks at it, and that goes away, and then they put a Picasso. But wouldn't it be better if it was on a conveyor belt going past, like a Japanese restaurant with the food? You choose what you want. It's fantastic. No. They wouldn't have any of that because that didn't seem to be the right and proper way to approach the thing. But I think it'd be quite a good way to view stuff. You get through a damn lot of stuff, right? You can have a cup of tea and a sandwich if you wished, or whatever. Anyway, I wasn't having that. But during the conversation about the new Tate building, the Tate Modern, which didn't have to be built in that building, it could have been knocked down. Somebody told me that 25 young architects and 25 artists had made a proposal for the new thing. And I said, well, that's it. They should just do it. Take a chance. They said, oh, it might not work. I thought, well, it might not work, but at least it would be what the architects or the young artists and architects wanted to do for the thing. It might have been a thing which we can't imagine what it might have been. Instead of what it is what we've seen 100 times before. I think it's an incorrect way of proceeding. That's one of the classrooms in the school. It's an abacus. Oh, hang on, I can't go back. Oh yeah, is there one before that? Yeah, that's there is that's John Hilliard, the artist, installing a work, which you put these different colours on different walls, and you can demonstrate by taking a photograph 4 or 5 times. You can, with all the different colours, you can make a photograph with 4 exposures. You can make a colour photograph, and you can show the students how to make a colour photograph, building up the colours with the 3 colours in black, and that's what that's about. And this is these are drawings of the children made of the school. Their visions of the school that they want. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take that whole wall of these drawings and make a school based on these drawings, and we're going to do it. The other thing that has to be said was that I went up to the school, and everything in the school has come from the children's idea of what the school should be. This is the brain, which is the IT center. They wanted a brain. I wanted to build a spaceship that crashed in this. I wanted to build a spaceship on the site, a crashed spaceship, where all the information was just, that's why they built the school around the spaceship. But they said, no, it's a brain, Bruce. That's a Scottish accent for those of you who are not familiar with it. This is a bunch of artists who were working with the students up there, and they built, that's a scale drawing of the school, plan of the school that they made, and they had it in the gym hall. You can't see, and then they got them all to do all sorts of things in it. And these are also, there's hundreds of boxes. These were the four different shaped classrooms that weren't allowed to build in the end. Anyway, it's just a kind of like there's workshops we did with the children, who were fantastic. That's the library. That's that again. Oh yeah, that's the outside of it. That's the inside of the IT suite. Anyway, that's one room. And that's another shot of inside the building. All that, this wall down here, right through the main spine, has got the original notes for the school blown up like a big blackboard through the school. They suggested that. They suggested they wanted an ecological place, an environmental room on the roof. They wanted a go up high. It's all built based on what they decided, which is cool. So they feel they actually own the thing, which is good. This is a painting I made of a dark garden in Menorca. This is another one, and that's another one. And there's another two potatoes. If I start repeating myself, you will let me know. This is a model of a thing I'm working on with also architects. So I'm trying to make this. This is what is it? It's a bloody tube station, but it's above ground and it's underground. And I'm trying to make a sculpture which is supporting this. All the machinery that powers all this thing is in this big box, and I'm going to do this stuff around it. So I'm working out at the moment. But and that's another version of that model. But then you see, you make it. If I made a photograph of that, I'm looking at that photograph and thinking, oh, the photograph's more interesting than all that stuff around it. It's all the garbage and all the crap. That's what's actually more interesting. And so what I'm actually doing as well, when I was teaching at the Slade painting, I used to go around the student studio, just go clack, clack, clack with a digital camera, photograph it, and I'd make a big book at the end of the year of all the photographs of all the students' work. And not isolated, just like poof, poof, poof. And then the students at the end would take their work, clean it up, put it on a white wall. It's always on a white wall, and it's just awful. And I've got this book full of all this crap, and it's so much more interesting. The crap is what it's about. This is an early live work I made at the Tate. It's called Good Manners of Physical Violence. And it was a sort of 45-minute kind of action around this blue box. And Nick Sirota insisted on putting these Henry Moores there because he thought it would annoy me. It didn't. This is a very early work made in 1969, which is called People Who Make Art in Glass Houses. And I made it. Well, what is kind of depressing about getting old, and I'm getting very old and depressed, and I thought I'm sick and tired of waking up feeling tired and sick, but there's an exhibition called Modern British Sculpture on at the Royal Academy, and how can there be modern British sculpture on a Royal Academy? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. Anyway, I made a criticism in 1970 of a show called Sculpture Out of the 60s, and I completely tore this show to pieces. But I thought, oh, I better include myself in this, otherwise they might tear me to pieces, all my colleagues. So I made this piece called People Who Make Art in Glass Houses, and so I accompanied the article in this magazine with this photograph. So I made this photograph for the magazine because it didn't seem to be necessary to make it for a gallery. It's best to put it straight into the magazine. So that's why that was made. But now I'm going to rewrite that piece about the sculpture show, which is on at the thing, called. Well, you'll see. I'm going to try and publish it. This is that's it. This is 1972 at the Tate. I had a retrospective. When you get a retrospective, that means you get pigeonholed and you put in a book and you put in the shelf, and that's you're dead. So at 27, I thought I want to give up being an artist. I don't want to get involved in this art anymore. I want to make sculpture, not get involved in this art. So I had a retrospective at the Tate. There's one day, long enough, and the show was the catalogue, and the catalogue was the show. People came, bought the catalogue, show disappeared, so did I. End of story. But then I resurfaced again later on. I resurfaced with this work in 1974, and this is a piece which was highly influential to the students and members of staff at the AA at the time. It's called High Up on a Baroque Palazzo, and it's a piece about movement through difficult, over-designed Italian spaces, and it was quite influential. And Bernard Schume, who was teaching here, he invited me to come with the guy who was to do a talk to the AA, and I met a lot of architects then, and that's why I had got there's an involvement with architects. I've had a lot of involvement with architects because of that. This piece, and he coming to see it and bringing me here and this, that, and the next thing. So a lot of things have come from just messing around and trying things out. This piece was to do with the kind of how you behave with the whole series of doors, it's just to do with behavior and creases in your shirt and difficult spectacles and big jackets. You couldn't get through the door, you had to walk that way and behave like this. I think we might be remaking this at the Tate. I've just found last 2 weeks ago, original footage from 37 years ago, this activity, which I might show. It's quite funny. This is another work, an architectural piece it's called the award-winning fish knife. The masterwork, the award-winning fish knife, and it's a work. It's a very anti-architectural work. It's a work to do with an architect who designs an award-winning fish knife and gets the job to redesign more or less the world. But he does it all with photographs, and these are huge photographs which we moved about with cranes. It was a total flop, this piece, because the piece was about mediocrity and institutionalized and computerized design systems, and because we did it with we didn't have computers in 1977 when we were doing this. We didn't have computers, and we had to do it all by hand, pencil and drawing, and we made all this really we made it in a mediocre way. We deliberately made it in a mediocre way to make a mediocre work, but to make a mediocre work, you don't make it in a mediocre way, you make it in a very high, superb way. To make it mediocre, you make it really good. So this was mediocre to the power of mediocrity. It was just crap. And it got this review in The Guardian. It said, this work isn't a disaster, it's a killer. So everybody who hated me and us came to see it for a week. It was packed out because they love a disaster in Britain. It was packed. It was a big success. In bums on seats it was, but it was a piece of work. It was not very good. This is this is a drawing for I showed you one earlier. This is a drawing for the Palace of Arts, Mortlake. With I was going to get all the buildings designed by artists. This was the Oldenburg, as I say, cheese thing. There's a big Panoni potato pavilion. There's a Gilbert and George. I used to quite like them. I was friends with them at this time. Gilbert and George tower block, you know, with the work on it. And so the building was the work, and the work was the building. There wasn't any work in the building. Some of the great museums that have been built in the world are fantastic buildings. And then they put all this shit in them. I don't know why the architects allow it. I mean, maybe I'm completely crap and old-fashioned, but I quite like the Bilbao place by Geary. But I don't like all the stuff in it much. It sort of ruins it. It kind of ruins the kind of beauty of the space. I'm sure he thinks that too. Well, get it out. This is the first attempt at the Arnolfini bar. I worked on this with David Chipperfield, and in 1987. This was the first kind of really successful art and architecture project, I think, because we met on. It's very interesting. The more you try to do something, the worse it gets. Somebody said, "Would you like to do the bar at the Arnolfini?" David Chipperfield was redoing it, and I said, "Who's he?" And he said, "Well, he didn't know who you are either." So we met on the train, went down, had a couple of drinks. I expressed what I thought. He expressed what he thought. He said, "Well, that's it. I'll leave you this room. Treat the room as an empty white space, and you just put your stuff in it." So I did this thing, and he said, "That's not. It's a bit tame. That looks a bit like what I might do. I don't want to do that." So I did something else. He said, "Oh, that's it." And we made it. We built it all by hand in cardboard, and then we stuck it in. And it worked. This is another failed project. I just do hundreds of failed projects. That's all. Nothing ever comes off. And I think, but that's not the point. The point is it's quite good that nothing. You can have actually said this. I like what you said to begin with. All those stuff about incidents and things, you know, it's all a mess. And it is actually, I believe that. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. You know, I really don't. You know, I've finished an idea. But this is a project in Glasgow. I got a project to do redesign the whole of a street in Glasgow, a pedestrian precinct, and I had this idea, which was. It's the worst part. It's like there's Bond Street down there, and it's not Bond Street, but it's kind of Bond Street here, and this is kind of Oxford Street. This is a really scuddy bit of Oxford Street, and it was really. I thought, well, what we could do, we just have to make it. We just turn the it's all these horrible shops like Little Woods and Mates and Dulces and I don't know, Virgin Records, same as every other town. And I think if you go to a town, you should understand that you're in Glasgow, you're in Liverpool, it shouldn't be like another one of those streets. So I thought, get all this stuff into the street. So basically we've got a Tunnock's Tower at Toffee, we've got a Bar's Iron Brew Bar, which was a running track, comes out of it, and there's a cloud, a black cloud that goes up and down, and these screens on the roof, as Phil in, these screens are CCTV cameras on the street, projecting what's on the street on the screen. So you can see what's happening on the screen, yourself on the screen, intercut by Martin Scorsese movies, of which I'm a great fan. And the whole I was to turn the street inside out. But yeah, and I thought it was a good one, but it failed. That's it, Bent Iron Brew Bar. Needed some drawings for that. I think that, I don't know whether anybody does any drawings anymore, but the drawing with a pencil or a piece of paint or a stick, it's very much different. I can draw on computers, but I much prefer on a bit of stick, or even drawing on a computer with a free form thing is much better, because things happen. It's when you cut something out, and the thing you cut out is more interesting than the thing you're cutting it all the time. It's like that. These are the first drawings for the primary school. These here that I built. It didn't end up like that, but these are sort of drawings for it. It's just different. There's hundreds of these. This is, I'll go very quickly. This is my project for the Arch of Art. There's a piece for public view of Whitehall, the Mall, and Northumberland Avenue. It's not a place for private. You can't read it. I'm not going to read it out, but it's a bit heavy. Very, very, very articulate and heavy. And it actually is a big arch, and it just stands and it squares off the square. That's a design of traffic jam, a concept car park, and this is my masterpiece. Got a bit quiet, hasn't it? This is actually my alternative House of Parliament, the dish of decision, not the dome. I just think that there's different ways to do things. I don't see why we have to keep going back to the same system to vote for people who we don't wish, to do things that we don't like continually. You don't keep going to the same restaurant you don't like. You go there 3 times and it's crap, you go somewhere else. So I was going to build a dish of decision making on the grounds opposite the Houses of Parliament, and this would be a TV station broadcasting live decisions made by people who know what they're talking about rather than people who don't. That's a painting. That's 3 ceramic jugs. That's a photograph of me with a sculpture in my soup. That's a model of David Smith in a bowl of consomme, rephotographed about 8 times. There's I think there's about 8 exposures there on the one film. That's a drawing for the film I just made called Postmodern Minestrone, which I'll be showing in London shortly. And that's another drawing for that. But making this film and using photographs of these photographs, small photographs of big bits of sculpture, I've actually made some big photographs of big bits of sculpture, and I've got some very large sculptures in my studio, but they look like real sculptures. These are another painting. That's another thing. That's a model of another thing. Oh, that's it. That's a fireplace. You've seen that? That's another work done with. Excuse me, with Will also. I've got to take this actually. It's quite important. Excuse me. Hello. Maybe can you be brief? Yeah. Where are you? I'm in the middle of a lecture. Can you phone me back in half an hour? Bye. That was a piece which failed. That was a building. I'd worked on the glass, a big glass painting for a children's hospital in London, but we didn't get it. I thought that was quite a good one. Look quite good. That's a piece of sculpture. It's a cool blue sculpture and a grey sculpture for walking up and down. That's made about 20 years ago. That's from the film Pool. There's a couple of stripes. And that's a couple of drawings for this sculpture I'm making to hold this structure up, which unfortunately won't be looking at. These shapes and forms are based on columns which were built about 5,000 years ago in Menorca that hold underground houses up. So it's coming from that, these old stuff. I'm quite interested in old stuff. That's another piece. It's just getting up. I think that's towards the end. Is that the end? Yeah. So basically, I mean, there's tons more stuff than that that I've been doing, all sorts of things that I haven't shown, but I'm quite interested in the fact that I'm interested in going where the mood takes me. But I'm rooted in I have a political stance, and I have a kind of notion. I actually am a sculptor. I was always going to be a sculptor, but I'm not making sculpture as such. The sculpture is something else. There's a very good German, not a very good, he's a very bad sculptor. I don't know if he's done it. There's a colleague of mine called Gary Woodley did a talk called Can Bad Sculptors Make Good Architects? And in this case, they can. This man's called Erwin Erich, died about a year ago, and he made these very beautiful, small brass, kind of blocky, kind of minimalist kind of sculptures. When they were that size, they're fantastic. Then he made them for streets, you know, when about Henry Moore size, you know, concrete blocks or marble, really tedious. But then he built 14 pavilions in this park outside Dusseldorf called Ile de Hombreuil, and he built these pavilions for this man's collection. And they're brick, recycled brick, just very simple buildings, and they're beautiful. So I think it's true. Basically, I think I'll stop now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay.
We have to swiftly move on to the next presenter. Move on to the next panel. The next panel is about notational, and we have Mathew Emmett. Mathew Emmett did his BSc at UCL and his diploma in the AA. He's an architect, academic, and a conceptual artist who questions mediated realities and mnemonic structures by exploring multidimensional total environments. Emmett is also the co-founder of a transdisciplinary research group called Estranged Space, who currently hold an artist residency at the Roman Baths in Bath. Emmett has also co-directed international schools in Detmold in Germany and has lectured at the Technische Universität Eindhoven. In 2007, Emmett received a research grant to attend the Karlhuis Stockhausen Composition and Interpretation course at Curtin, probably saying that wrong, Germany, for the analysis of compositional strategies of Lichtbilder to formulate systems for interpreting sound as a spatial concept for architecture. So I'd like to welcome Mathew Emmett. Thank you.
Thank you. It's this one. Right, firstly I'd like to thank Shaun and the team for inviting me to come to this interesting event today. And I'm going to be presenting some visual work from my theoretical exploration, as well as some very kind of just creative, very kind of subjective set of drawings, also exploring the form of space. I've called this talk Accelerating the Frame of Reference, because it has a direct link to the physics of inertia, and I'm supposed looking through this work to explore the theory of space as if it was a physical plastic medium that can be pliable and felt. So, also Shaun has asked me to talk about communication. So a lot of my work and thinking is done through diagrams, notations, modelling, etc., both computer and hand-drawn. So I think diagramming for this instance is a good way to generate an abstract model of what you consider to be your space. So this was me putting down all my thoughts about what I think I'm interested in space, and in particular felt space, and how I situate my work, which is between sort of phenomenological design and sort of looking at cybernetics with the particular idea of feedback loops and how we behave and interact within the environments. I'm going to be talking about the fact of kind of spatial perception and linking that back to Stockhausen and his idea of event form. And I don't know if you know Stockhausen's work, but he does a lot of, he's died unfortunately recently, but he did a lot of spatial projections of sound, and I find that ephemeral movement of sound in space very exciting. So the work really is at the interface between the exterior of the environment and the thresholds of the interior, which is our psychology, and looking at where those thresholds are with the notion of situated cognition. I find that simple diagrams can convey a lot of information. So this diagram is looking at the egocentric space, where psychological space as a set of cognitive abstractions from reflections on personal experience. So this is you interacting with the environment, picking up these signals being transmitted through your body perception. And then how we use and interpret those elements to govern what we see and project back into the space. And this is where you can play with time experiments, memory, etc., etc. And I'm also interested in working with spatial sites which have a lot of palpable traces of existing experiences, like war sites, underground spaces, etc., etc. In doing a lot of researching, reading, exploration, again, I generate more diagrams to try and conceptualize and put down in a spatial orientation my kind of thoughts. So this is an egocentric idea again, that we are situated in the center where our haptic experiences are very direct. And then we have the axis of movement. This is where we kind of locate and physically move in space. And then that space is then built up by sequences of spatial encounters. And then we have this idea of the macrosphere, which is what I'm calling the kind of cultural impact of political, social agendas onto space itself. And as you see, kind of this kind of web of time that spirals and compresses and opens up in between those penetrable spheres. They're not meant to be seen as physical barriers at all. They're more to be kind of thresholds of zones opening up. Developing that sort of form of diagram, I then sort of work with matrix as a way of generating recombinant gestures of sort of the creative act of transforming those elements into recombinant forms and spaces. So to set up my own kind of matrix, I have to generate a form of language which explicitly describes those elements. And the first one is looking at the exterioceptive senses, which are the physical haptic experiences of you in space. coupled with the interior receptive senses, which are the kind of feelings, emotions, this kind of behavioural, cognitive, experiential dynamics. So again, it's the bridging of those two exterior and interior kind of domains. I started to apply these kind of ideas and theories to existing spaces, and I've discovered a whole series of these underground bunkers which are quite claustrophobic, tight, small spaces. And what I wanted to do here is see if I could diagram my physical experience of these zones. And what I'm saying here is that the macrosphere, the exteriority of culture, i.e. in this sense war, directly compresses onto the haptic interior domain, and you feel that presence very palatable. That when you're in these spaces, the memories, the traces, the kind of latent marks exert a strong force on your psychology. So now moving, as an architect or a designer, moving now on to kind of design principles, going back to this idea of finding a specific language to design and work from. These are starts of my notational series, where I'm looking at strategies of light and using the simple symbol of the dilating camera, what do you call it? Shutter thing. Iris, thank you. Opening and closing, and then giving that a vector coordinate which gives it a location in space. So these are my just sort of notes on how to develop a mapping tool which spatializes where light is coming from. That's one principal ingredient. I then expanded that into diagrams thinking about the other sensorial systems that we perceive space through, and started to work with a cartographer and a graphics designer to help me simplify my somewhat complicated and overlapping thoughts. So these are my, this is when the drawing as a process helps me kind of resolve and think about notation as a means of exploration. So that then evolved into this very specific mapping system, which is what I call a mimetic representation, i.e. the central area actually maps how we see with our very focused vision and then our peripheral vision. Then that's layered with our auditory, our sound perception, and then the outer rings are to do with our emotive responses to space, together with our, the somatic experience. And what I'm proposing is that this is a model for increasing spatial intelligence, understanding how we locate ourselves within space. This tool is then used to map experiences, and this is from an earlier project where I did a 24-hour sound recording of Marsham Street with the big three ugly sisters before they were knocked down. And I used a similar system to record a 24-hour cycle of sound events on this redundant site, walking the periphery of this building and picking up a whole range of very exciting different types of sounds. And I suppose what I'm interested in is trying to visualize the invisible kind of phenomena, and these drawings, which are a whole series of drawings in about the length of these two tables, start to build up the complexity of the kind of sonic soundscape. So I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but now I'm going into notation, where I'm experimenting with the spatial loci of where these sounds and emotive forces are coming from. And I'm using these terms or these verbs as physical tools to exert a force on these experiences. So exteriorizing, inverting, dimension jump, expand, amplify, vectorize, partitioning, resequence, repolarization, territorialize, looping, partitioning, layering, etc., etc. So these are my, this is my palette for experimentation on the data that I've gathered. And again, the drawing for me is a tool to communicate that kind of thinking. The second series of drawings, or third series, sorry, so it's the mapping, then it's a notation, and then it's these drawings, which I call, borrowed a term from Stockhausen, are event forms. So they are trying to choreograph audio-visual events in space and bring into play the temporal qualities of the performance. As well as the visual diagram, I then model these drawings to get a three-dimensionality into the work, because I am interested again in space and architecture, sculpture, etc. But the model becomes another physical interaction between my cognition and ideas and the work itself. So if it's all right, I'd just like to play a sonic representation of that physical model. Or cable? No, not yet. Thank you. Okay. Basically, it's what they call concrete music, where you're sampling sounds from the environment and then remanipulating or working with those sounds quite sculpturally and plastically through these model forms to try and start to think about reorganizing principles about architecture and space. And the sound piece you just heard plays with the notion of panning, where you're physically moving sound in the space, yet the constant of the footsteps is the idea that you're plummeting or doing a cross-section through that auditory space. And there's also a sense of horizon and kind of background, as well as the detailed kind of visceral sounds. So I'm trying to describe space acoustically within those terms. I'm also very fascinated with this, obviously, this sense of immersion, and I make kind of sculptural, physical, filmic pieces which explore the sense of immersion and temporalities. A recent project, I've got an artist residency at the Roman Baths in Bath, and Shaun was mentioning that I teamed up with a friend, colleague called David Littlefield, who's an author and teacher on architecture, and we set up this research group called Estranged Space, and we're really looking at spaces which have an impact on our presence, our awarenesses. And I think what's exciting when you're working with an academic arena is that you can team up with other research groups to kind of complement, extend, and critique your work. So I've sought out an interesting group called Perception Lab in Hochschule Ostwald in Lippe, practicing there. And they're focused on recording the impact of spaces on our psychology. So we're particularly interested in a series of underground vaults at the baths, which are uncurated spaces full of amazing kind of artifacts, just dumped there. And it's right on the cusp of being developed and turned into a heritage kind of extension of the existing space. So we've got in right in time just to record and work with these spaces before that unique character and atmosphere and quality gets heritaged, transformed. And we're using a kind of collaboration between fine art architectural practice as well as quite scientific systems. So one of these is the eye tracking, which was related to your the reading, the scanning of the newspaper. And basically what this does, it records your pupil's attention and where it's focused on when you navigate and walk through a space. So there's a camera focused on you, and there's a camera focused out, and the whole system gets calibrated. And the idea is that we can digitally record where your gaze is directed as an AVI file. A second system is what we call the biofeedback system, and that is basically it's a smart lie detector, and it's recording your heart rate, your temperature, your humidity, on all of your biological systems. And that's all collected as sort of data files. Now, I'm writing I'm making a audio visual installation to insert into the space, and I'm using the data feeds from these kind of sampling technologies together with my mappings to drive the films. So this is where I'm sort of hooking up into cybernetics without getting too theoretically, but the idea of generating feedback loops as behavioral mechanisms. And what I'm generating are synthetic apertures, which are the projected lights, coupled with sound to give the light a sense of physicality. And these will be modeled to illuminate the circumference of the rooms, and they're going to be zooming in and out using things like a Dutch angle to kind of extend the sense of psychological unease to hopefully generate a sense of vection or almost like seasickness, so that you physically feel the space around you. And I'm using opposite colours to kind of try and generate a greater sense of space between these apertures which open and close. Also importantly, the whole thing will oscillate and vibrate to give a greater sense of temporality and physicality. So that's, we're actually going to go to the baths in February, in about 2 weeks' time. We're going to do 2 or 3 days work there to generate this kind of stuff. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I said that I also, as well as more theoretical work, I love to do these drawings, and these drawings are much more intuitive, but they also come from working with the site directly. And I think what's quite difficult is unseparating the theory from the creative work. And I think these, I'm going to show you a series of drawings which are vehicles to explore the theories, I think. So again, these are all site-based, and this drawing is from a Second World War air hangar, and I'm superimposing some sort of mapping system within that space, and then making that 3D and spatial. They're also kind of film influenced. And I like doing large drawings. They're widescreen format, so they generate a greater sense of immersion within the work. And although it's a 2D medium, I think I enjoy the the craft of trying to make them very three-dimensional and spatial. So these come from a bigger series of projects which have been going on for a long time, and I'm taking environments to do with transformation and architecturalizing those forms of narratives. Part of this work also includes kind of photographic and kind of prototyping, and a lot of the, going back to this notion of communication, I'm a great junkie for using whatever medium technology I can get my hands on to best describe what I have within my mind. So they might be photographs of prototyped forms, they might be elements from film clips, etc., and then using the computer in this instance as a compository to kind of put together these works. So this is from a site in Berlin, in Germany. So there's something, going back to this notion of temporality and event form, there's something very solid to allow the event form to be very ephemeral and temporal. So I like to play with those kind of extremes and using kind of latent memories within these sites to generate these kind of these ideas. A long time ago, I actually did a bit of study at St Martin's. I can remember my tutor saying that you'd be a very colourful architect, and I do enjoy playing with light and colour. More recently, I've gone back to making kind of physical models, and then using different software to animate those models to give the sense of atmosphere, depth of space, etc., make that become more palatable. And there's a lot of these objects that I've made the models from have actually come from different sites that I'm exploring. So, although not directly linked to the more theoretical mapping, notational and theoretical models of cybernetics phenomenology, these are also interesting outcomes for me which I enjoy making, and it helps me extend my ideas and theories. I'm not a writer, so I think making work for me is where more interesting ideas come. And I think when you're doing a PhD, the difficulty then is trying to transcribe all that stuff into a kind of a thesis thing. And I'm thinking of employing a ghostwriter to do that for me. I think that's me.
Great. Thank you. Next we have up Kate Davies, who works with Emmanuel Vercruysse, who's based at the Bartlett. She's a unit tutor here on the Diploma Unit 6. Kate and Emmanuel's practice, they're designers, makers and educators. They're known as LiquidFactory, which they run under as a practice, which occupies the hinterlands of an architectural practice. Their current work explores the notions of extreme environments through translation between writings, drawings and making. They think about dreams of mysterious landscapes, and as I said before, Emmanuel teaches at the Bartlett, Unit 23, and Kate teaches here in Diploma Unit 6, where they both kind of are quite interested in digital manufacturing processes as a way of communicating their designs. Welcome, Kate.
What's going on here?
We'll have one more before lunch.
Do I have to set it up again?
Probably. Did you go to sleep?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's this one, right? This one. 1280. Excuse me. What's it matter?
That's me. That's me doing it.
Okay. This slideshow. 3% tools. Oh. Yeah, try that. Ah, good. Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to try and talk quite swiftly because we've got to catch up a little bit of time. As Shaun said, I run a kind of small practice with my partner Emmanuel called LiquidFactory, and it's kind of a strange one. It's somewhere between manufacture and, I suppose, narrative and poetry about kind of more ephemeral things. So the kind of ephemeral sitting next to the very physical. And I'm just going to talk really kind of quite honestly in a straightforward way about how we work and the kind of processes we use, and specifically just in relation to this one project which is about a desert. It's about, I suppose, in terms of communication, not only communicating to somebody else, but communicating to yourself during the process of design, which I think is something that we sometimes forget needs a lot of attention. And I think that not only to ourselves as individuals, but also between people within a practice, and how different people within a practice can kind of inform each other in the way that they work. So it relates to how a narrative can kind of set up an imaginative place in the mind about a landscape, and how drawings and objects could inhabit that landscape, I suppose. The Harmattan haze hangs heavy. A series of incisions punctuate the horizon. Within a matrix of shifting fields, these fragments rest on a restless earth, weathering the violent storms and slow creeping of this landscape. Scattered solid and heavy across the dunes, carved by the sting of sand and licked by the sparking tongues of an electric wind, a dark presence is half revealed. Like the buried village swallowed by the dunes, huge hulking masses cut the path of the blistering wind, shaping the landscape surrounding them. A surfacing reef, corralling the sand like slowly circling sharks. Deep into the Calancio sand sea in the Libyan Sahara, an abandoned plane glides silently towards the dunes. In 1943, the American B-24 bomber, the Lady Be Good, lost its way in a sandstorm and disappeared. It's thought extreme winds blew the plane off course, and that static from a huge sandstorm affected the navigational equipment. The crew was forced to bail out over the Libyan Sahara, and the wreckage and the scattered bodies lay untouched and mummified for 16 years, awash in the dunes, mapping out the trajectory of an event in a state of suspension. The diaries of the men were preserved in the sand and provide a ghostly account of their last agonizing days walking across the merciless emptiness of this sand sea. It was an area so remote they had no hope of being rescued, and the plane was lost to the crew who sought it on foot, and lost to the many other who searched in vain by air. So this is a map. It's actually a map of one of the giant sand seas in Libya, and we find it really interesting because, as you can see in this image here, which actually I find this a really fascinating image because it's kind of scaleless. It could be sand on a pavement, could be clay manipulated by the hand, or it could be, which is what it is, a massive sand sea in Sahara Desert seen from the air. So we're interested in this kind of territory of uncertainty and ambiguity that exists within its landscape, and we kind of take that as an inspiration for a way of working, of kind of consciously trying to keep a space within the project for ambiguity, I suppose. And that's where it kind of talks to these ideas of communication and notation, whether you're communicating to yourself or whether you're communicating to someone else about something. So this is a map of the sand sea, and it's incredible because it's not really a map of anything, because there's nothing really fixed there. These sand dunes migrate in strong sandstorms. They kind of they shift. There's kind of general trends. The nomadic Tuareg navigate by interpreting the patterns of wind and sand. So they negotiate this realm of uncertainty by learning to recognize the dunes that are revealing kind of more stable, larger trends within the background of noise of a fluid terrain that's kind of got that's unpredictable and untrustworthy, I suppose. So it's a strange kind of landscape to think about and to imagine about. We're interested in imagining the space of imagination within landscapes, especially from here within a city, these kind of evocative, mysterious places that exist somewhere else on the planet, I suppose. Like tentative drawings, these maps are attempts to capture these clusters of nebulous elements, elusive things that, they're kind of captured in a typical formation, but they can never define any specifics like an ordinary map of something more fixed would do. So this is kind of revealing a process. We get this kind of collection of bits for a project. I mean, I don't know, maybe other people start that way too. A collection of bits and pieces that become I suppose, a little mini ecology within a project. And I don't think we try and define it too closely to begin with. There's a kind of idea about this crash plane and these people wandering around in nothingness, and this plane drifting and being buried and uncovered by sand dunes, and the kind of violent winds in the Sahara, the nomadic Tuareg and the blue cloaks, and the static generated by sandstorms and the movement. It's kind of a violent but silent kind of, not in the fart sense, but landscape. It's a kind of, so we start to explore the character of an intervention through sketches, I suppose, and the idea was that we would generate a kind of series of objects that would sit with the narrative text, or as props together with the narrative text, and together with an imagining of this landscape and the fluctuations, and as a kind of cluster of elements that were floating around in the landscape that complement the written prose, I suppose. They're kind of scaleless. They're artifacts, but they're also, you can kind of project imagination on them, I suppose. Oops. Sorry. We're back. So scattered, shattered amongst them across the vastness are the fragmented remains of something once whole. Shrapnel in the sand, changing the dynamics of dune formation. They are a measure against which to read the landscape, a datum in the flow, but they are untrustworthy players on an illusory stage. Drifting cadavers with soft, compliant bodies, may be swallowed up in a giant dune for years, or laid bare like wrecks, performing a slow re-articulation of a landscape. Above in the storm-darkened sky, the flighty whip of wind in a cloak and crack of static. A field of conducting vessels, collectors within the dielectric of air and earth, forming a vertical bridge. Like buoys animated by the forces around them, they are violently shaken by fiery desert winds. It's not very easy to see that from there. It looks great on my screen. So I suppose then it's a matter of processes, this kind of atmosphere for the project set up, and we like to kind of work quite loosely and intuitively and use the drawings not to specify and design and kind of detail things out before you start making something, but to use the process of making as a kind of tailoring where it undergoes a gradual process of refinement through a series of fittings, I suppose, to kind of drawing it incrementally towards a fit. That's what we're interested in the objects we make. So, I mean, in terms of the two of us, Emmanuel, I'm definitely more on the side of the narrative and imagery, Emmanuel approaches it much more from a point of view of how are these objects made, how can they be kind of manifest, what are they made of, how does the material and the processes they're made of and with actually become part of the project. So, we'll have a conversation like, I'll talk about it's a drifting thing, it's a wash, it's like a bit of shrapnel in the sand. And he'll say, we could make it in solid metal, and we talk about these talismans that the Tuareg cast in the sand, metal talismans. And so we got excited about sand casting. We went to Bristol, got a second-hand furnace, and started playing with it in the workshop. I mean, not metalsmiths, but we were interested in how the process that we would go through to make the things is part of the project, not just something that you put in a box and don't show anyone, I suppose. So these are foam pieces that are made to be sand cast. So you put them in the sand, you pour the metal in, the metal melts the sand and reveals an aluminium version of these pieces. But the important thing is that they're made from the sketches, but they're made in a kind of extending the looseness and the gestural activity of sketching, which I think is really important. It's because it's not, that there's some kind of unknown in there that you can't always quantify. We were trying to bring that through into the physical pieces as well. Carving, I mean, it's quite there's a kind of sculptural process, and then redrawing and recarving these pieces as kind of fragments that are born from sketches. So they're born from these loose little tentative marks that you make that you're not quite sure what they are, but you turn it upside down and reinterpret it another way. And I think that there's something kind of quite freeing about that process as part of the process of design within a kind of larger project, I suppose. So this is about a kind of small part of the process we kind of undertake. And then they're buried in the sand, and there's kind of this nice resonance with the site that comes from something that you wouldn't normally show anyone in the project, is actually something in the middle of the project. It relates back to a narrative that you had at the beginning of the project. And then there's this kind of transformative process of sand casting where the metals kind of takes over this soft, compliant material that you can carve and sketch in sand and manipulate so easily, becomes a solid thing, a solid kind of gesture, I suppose. So these are the aluminium pieces that then refined and kind of re-refined in the workshop. And this is a kind of sequence. It's actually really difficult to see the images, I'm sorry about that, but at the top you can see a sketch, a really loose sketch. It was actually in the corner of a piece of paper that had a much bigger, more kind of garish sketch in the middle of it, and we didn't notice it at first, but it was quite a beautiful thing, so we decided to try and make this object with it. And the one in the second from bottom is a 3D scan, where we scan the object so that, because the original gets lost, we like to have this kind of ghost of the thing. It becomes another digital sketch, I suppose. So in terms of communication, I suppose it's a communication between the two of us about the project, about trying to, it's bringing somebody into your world, I think. Design and how you construct that world is really what the process is about. So these objects, are they, talismans? What's, you start to say, well, what scale do we see them at? They're meant to drift through the desert. They're meant to kind of be part of this landscape that is so strange because it's fluid, because it's like a sea, because it's not solid. And so they become, with the text, part of this kind of narrative with imagery. They're kind of just the way you frame them, or you do a drawing with them, you photograph them. They become framed by this narrative that we set up. But then they're also just an object that we made. It's they kind of exist. And I like those two images because one is definitely saying, "Oh, this is really big and it's in the desert," and the other one's saying, "No, it's in the back of the studio and it's on a sandcasting table." But they have a resonance, I think. And back to this kind of space for ambiguity in the image, which is why I love this image so much, because you decide what you want to project onto it, and I think that that's true between yourselves in the design process as much as it is about talking to other people about your own projects and allowing them a space to project their kind of imaginings onto your work, I suppose. And that's it.
That's great. Okay. Thank you, Kate. So the final one before we break is James Moe. James Moe's a PhD candidate for the Centre for Advanced Inquiry in Integrative Arts in the Planetary Collegium, which is run by Roy Ascott since 2003, and concurrent with his doctoral research process, he has run a series of projects in which each investigates the idea of composition and the moving image, specifically in the context of real-time computation and interaction. This arose from a desire to interrogate the qualia space of the moving image within interactive systems relative to a range of behaviours and/or observer positions, which attempts to situate users as a conscious conspirator or compositor. Sorry.
Compositor, indeed, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm on this laptop, is that all right? Okay. Yeah. This one here. Okay. No. Oh, thanks. Right. Yeah. Well, while you're doing that, I'll just say thank you very much, Shaun, for inviting me to be part of this. I'm not an architect in any sense. My background is basically kind of interaction design with quite a sprinkling of kind of film studies thrown in. I initially wanted very much to study film until I kind of got involved in computing and really fell in love with the idea of the potential for change and real-time interaction within kind of moving image material. And in terms of the theme that Shaun has given us of kind of communication for this morning, I think the kind of struggle in the work that I've been doing in the last 10 years or so is to actually identify what qualitatively the moving image can actually potentially offer us communicatively, especially in scenarios where the moving image is being remediated into real-time interactive systems. And my work is really an attempt to deal with that problem. And I hope I'll be able to show you some examples of it.
In a minute. This isn't reading. No, it's just not reading the...
Maybe I can use one of the other computers.
If you want, yeah. Just plug that one back in.
I'll go and grab the USB stick. It's way off there.
See my dirty desktop, isn't it?
No, it's alright. I'll close the desktop down as soon as it appears. There you go.
Is it PowerPoint?
No, it's just a PDF.
Alright, just one up there.
Yeah, you're fine. I've done that.
It's alright for me to just carry on here then?
Absolutely.
Oh, no, that's not it, is it? Where's the USB? There it is.
Yeah, just have to look through your desktop.
Okay. There you go. Okay. Oops. What's happened? Right, so thanks, I'll get going. This initial image that we see here is one of John Strzaka's kind of cut out postcard images, and I put that in just to partly to acknowledge the debt. There's lots of debts in my work to lots of different people sort of plundering from everywhere, but he happens to have an exhibition on at the Whitechapel at the moment, so it was a good time to sort of acknowledge that one. I know we're running over, so I'm going to try and be quite quick. So montage as a participatory system. I've been told that many times that this is a silly idea, that they're kind of sort of diametrically opposed. So I'll try and talk a little bit about why I've tried to do this foolish kind of attempt. And there's a number of kind of assertions here, kind of beginning with the idea that complexity resists representation. And what I've been told many times is the kind of foolishness of this research is using a kind of profoundly kind of descriptive technology like the moving image, or a profoundly kind of representational system to try and get at ideas that are sort of beyond representation. But that's really nothing new if you look at it in the history of kind of like art and design. That's been going on for a while, I think. So I try and go back to the beginning a little bit. I think I had this sort of dissatisfaction with the way in which the moving image is organised, the kind of superstructure around it, how it's built up, controlled, edited and received. And that started off, I think, a little bit as an instinctive thing for me when I was very young, because I was lucky that my mother and father were involved in a kind of experimental theatre situation, and I kind of grew up witnessing a lot of that. And in the way that was put together, there was this multiplexing of pre-recorded material, film and video, and live action material, either actors or dancers, and sound, and all these things were sort of layering amongst one another, but in a way that was effectively being kind of consciously composited by the audience, but it wasn't looking for any sort of narrative closure. I think I was quite lucky to receive almost that kind of education in perception, and I think maybe because of that, I always had this love-hate relationship with the cinema. And I've always found that the kind of activity that is around the moving image and its kind of production and reception more important or equally important than the actual moving images themselves, or at least I've said here linked and completely critical. So one example I think of where maybe I got that idea from in the first place was that theatre idea. Another one might be my sort of peculiar fascination with what was going on behaviourally in the cinema before the film started. And now you could find a kind of present day analogous thing in kind of so-called social networking scenarios, like on YouTube, where you've got a kind of fixed piece of data, but you've got a lot of much more, I would say, potentially more interesting metadata going on around it in terms of the real-time stuff that's linked to it. But like from a moving image point of view, up until now, it's felt like those real-time interactions that were going on around the outside of the moving image didn't really have the possibility or potential to feed back into them and change it, or not in real time. It's kind of a separate discussion. So you've got the piece and then you've got the discussion that goes on around it. So what I'm sort of suggesting is that I had these feelings where I didn't really know that there was a whole kind of field of much brighter people than me who were theorizing all this kind of stuff. And, you know, Guattari in 3 Ecologies talks about it in the sense of a kind of infantilizing system, the mass media, as a kind of profoundly negative influence. And I only came to that like fairly recently. So what I've been trying to do is kind of theorize with these kind of ideas and also make kind of practice experiments. I mean, like a few people in this room, I'm sort of on the PhD sort of shuffle. So it's a practice-based one, so we make lots of things. So I'll show you some of these. And although I've been told it's perverse, I think we're all sort of perverts at some level. And I'll show you some of these attempts at thinking about what open montage might be. This is just a series of images around this idea of the kind of the activity that goes on around and before we watch the film. So I started to experiment with interactive media online, really, about early 90s, I suppose, and tried to create some sites where, at the time, it felt like the dominant thing was to try and combine everything into a kind of what was then called interactive multimedia, and that it would be whiz-bang and really exciting, and a bit like television on the web, which I thought was a really bad idea. And so I tried to work on building some interfaces that did the opposite, where things were more or less fairly deconstructed and the user had to put them together for themselves. So I was trying to look at where those tolerances were between whether you could have, you know, what degree of control you needed, and looking at the kind of cybernetics stuff, and the kind of ultimate goal, which would supposedly be this kind of distributed authorship scenario. So this was a kind of ongoing disavowal of the idea of story. And there's just a couple of frames here. This was late 90s, around maybe 2000. A kind of collaborative web space which had lots of contributors, photographers and video makers and theory people. And this is kind of a screen grab of after someone had been playing with it for a while, and you pull all these things out as palettes and sort of assemble them on the screen. And these are just more screen grabs from within that. I'm going to try and speed up. And some kind of real-time compositing work. And I just put a little quote in here because I know we haven't got much time today, but there's a longer article in issue 1 of Design Ecologies, if you're interested in any of this, which you could have a look at if you like. And this is basically the abstract from that article. And I've more or less said all that to you already. So I'll skip over that. So the projects that I've been working on more recently, this is one screen from one kind of iteration of them. It has a lot to do with layering and the degree to which, as Shaun said in the introduction, users might take on this role of a kind of conscious kind of compositing. And this was one version of that was done last year for a theatre production of a series of Mark Ravenhill plays. And this was a kind of a series of projection surfaces that could be wheeled around, and they had projectors fixed to them so that you could actually use them at various depths, kind of upstage, downstage, and with various amounts of action going on in between. And the idea of that really was that normally you need to have a fixed kind of focal point with the projection, and you can't really do that much compositing wise, but these screens were able to be moved up and down and sort of laterally as well. So you could have elements of typography on one screen, other elements on another screen, and the image is kind of being variously put together by the audience in different ways. And these are some sort of compressed versions of what all those elements were. And in these ones you see it as a kind of single layer. The next kind of images are trying to deal with this kind of main problem of the way in which, obviously, the moving image is thought of as a kind of sequential thing, largely, and I'm trying to suggest that it perhaps needn't be completely, or there could be other ideas that we could work with, the kind of what I'm sort of talking about, the idea of an asymmetrical sequence, and kind of departing from what I've said here, linear sequence, into a kind of non-causal complexity. So we'll see what you think. This is one, they look very dark on your screen, but this is one kind of thing that I'm working on at the moment, which splits the video signal into its constituent red, green and blue elements, and you can pull those apart, and each of those becomes an ability to kind of annotate the original image with either sounds, more images, or texts. So that's one part of it. This is another section that it's just really, they're really simple visualizations, but it just has to do with the idea of if we're not, or if, as I'm attempting to do, not using the traditional kind of linear timeline, which has obviously gone from original film editing and been adopted into every form of so-called non-linear editing, then what would the alternative to the timeline be? And I've been working with the idea of these kind of carousel-like structures, which they're not a million miles away from kind of traditional slide projector carousels, so that instead of a kind of timeline for the moving image, you have a kind of recursive system into which you can find either individual frames or sections, but they don't represent the beginning or end of anything. They just represent various points at which you could dip into a sequence. Yeah, this is kind of more assertions, which I think, given the time, I'll probably skip over, and it's all in the article. So if you were interested, you could read up in full. But really, this is mainly talking about the attempt to kind of reposition this idea of, I don't call it film, I do call it the moving image, to try and distance it from from 100 years of film history. But a lot of it span off these ideas, like for instance Virilio's idea that consciousness emerges from montage, and this is a kind of attempt at some sort of conclusion to what I'm saying, that I feel essentially that this kind of phase that we've been through for perhaps the last 20 years, which was a little bit of an attempt on the part of so-called new media to adapt or sort of ape some of the tropes of film in order to become more persuasive or more high resolution, is kind of missing an opportunity. And the kind of interactive moving image culture I'm interested in is not really an immersive one. It's kind of more about kind of disbelief. And so I'm suggesting that disbelief should not be suspended in the traditional narrative sense, but actually actively encouraged. And these are just some other frames that show some simple parts of the interfaces, like how you input text, for instance. And this last image is really, really black on the screen, so you can't really see it. But it's kind of, it would be a persuasive argument for the idea that all this research is mad and a waste of time. But there is quite a lot of stuff buried in there. But that is a little bit like what these frames start to look like when they've got lots and lots of stuff dumped on top of them. More like that, with a bit more colour and a bit more depth.
So I think it's
All right, I'll finish there because I know we need to get lunch, so thanks a lot.